History likes to present itself as settled. Dates confirmed, facts filed away, nothing left to question. But look closer, and the cracks appear. Records that contradict each other. Events no one can fully explain, even the people who lived through them. Moments so strange they've been debated for generations without resolution. We're taught the past is fixed, unchangeable, known. It isn't. Beneath the official version lies a stranger one. One full of gaps, contradictions, and things that simply don't add up. Tonight we're stepping into that uncertainty. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. On the northern tip of Newfoundland, where the Atlantic wind moves low across open grass, there's a place called L'Anse aux Meadows. Nothing about it announces itself. No towering ruins, no grand facade, just the faint outline of turf walls sunk into the earth like the memory of a structure, rather than the structure itself. Archaeologists confirmed in the 1960s what sagas had claimed for centuries. Norse explorers stood here, nearly 500 years before Columbus ever saw the shores of the Caribbean. The evidence is not in question. Iron nails, a bronze cloak pin, a spindle whorl, the kind used by Norse women to spin wool. Radiocarbon dating places the site's use at almost exactly 1021 AD, a date so precise it comes not from pottery or ash, but from a solar storm. In that year, a burst of cosmic radiation left a chemical signature in the growth rings of trees around the world. One of the timbers found at the site carries that signature, allowing researchers to count forward and land, with unusual confidence, on a single year. So the Norse were here. That much is settled. But L'Anse aux Meadows was never meant to be permanent. The buildings show signs of short-term use, a waypoint, a repair station, perhaps a staging ground for expeditions further inland. And this is where the certainty ends, and the mystery begins. The Icelandic sagas, Eric the Red's saga and the saga of the Greenlanders, describe a land called Vinland, rich with wild grapes, self-sown wheat, and timber suitable for building ships. They describe voyages further south than Newfoundland, along coastlines warmer and more fertile than anything this site could offer. If L'Anse aux Meadows was merely an outpost, where, precisely, was Vinland itself? For over a century, historians have searched. Some point to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Others argue for the coast of New Brunswick, or further still toward New England, where wild grapes genuinely grow. A scattering of disputed artifacts, a coin found in Maine, stone structures in Rhode Island once claimed as Norse in origin, have each, in turn, been proposed as evidence and later contested, dismissed, or re-examined. None have been confirmed. None have been fully disproven either, in the sense that certainty rarely survives contact with a 500-year-old wooden ship that left almost nothing behind. Then there are the saga's harder claims, hints of contact, of conflict, with people the Norse called Skraelingar, the earliest recorded encounter between Europeans and indigenous peoples of North America. What did that meeting look like? How far did it reach? The written accounts are brief, filtered through centuries of oral retelling before ink ever touched vellum. History remembers the encounter happened. It does not remember the details. Why did the Norse leave when they clearly had the means to stay? Some cite conflict. Some cite distance from Greenland, the nearest Norse settlement, and the sheer difficulty of supplying an outpost across open ocean. Others have proposed more speculative explanations. Shifting climate, disease, or simply that the risk never justified the reward. None of these answers are proven. All remain plausible. What we know is this: the Norse reached North America in 1021 AD, stood on this coastline, and then, for reasons still unclear, walked back into their ships and left. Somewhere beyond that turf-walled outpost, a warmer, greener land waited. One the sagas insist was real. One archaeology has never quite been able to find. If Vinland exists beneath a modern coastline, it hasn't spoken yet. If Vinland was the frontier the Norse could never quite hold on to, Greenland was supposed to be the opposite, a place they mastered, settled, and made their own. and for a while, they did. Two settlements once stood along its southwestern coast, carved out of one of the harshest environments human beings have ever chosen to call home. The eastern settlement was the larger of the two, but it's the smaller one, the western settlement, near modern-day Newark, that has left historians with the deeper silence to sit with. Picture it as it once was. Turf and stone farmhouses hugging the fjords, cattle buyers built low against the wind, church bells marking time across a landscape of ice and gray water. At its height, the western settlement may have supported several hundred people, farmers, hunters, traders, living an existence that, while never easy, was sustainable enough to last for centuries. They raised livestock. They hunted seal and caribou. They traded walrus ivory to Europe, a commodity valuable enough to draw ships across a genuinely dangerous stretch of ocean, year after year. And then, sometime in the mid-14th century, the Western settlement simply stopped. The evidence isn't a single dramatic event. No burned buildings, no mass grave, no written account of catastrophe. It's an absence. A steady rhythm of trade, church records, and seasonal travel that, at some point, goes quiet. The most detailed account we have comes from a man named Ivar Barderson, a church official sent to investigate the settlement sometime around 1350. What he found, according to the record attributed to him, was nothing. No people. Livestock apparently left loose and untended. No struggle, no explanation. Just an emptiness where a community had been. Historians don't dispute that the settlement ended. The archaeology confirms it. What they've never agreed on is why, or how quickly it happened. The most straightforward explanation points to climate. Tree ring and ice core data confirm that Greenland's Norse settlers arrived during a relatively mild period, now often called the medieval warm period, and that conditions cooled significantly in the centuries that followed. A shift some researchers connect to the broader onset of the Little Ice Age. Colder summers would have shortened growing seasons, stressed livestock, and made the already narrow margin of survival narrower still. It's a compelling theory, supported by real environmental data. But cooling climates, on their own, don't typically empty a settlement in what appears to have been a single generation. Communities under environmental stress usually shrink gradually, adapt, or migrate in stages. The Western settlement's end looks faster than that, so other explanations have entered the conversation. Some point to the Norse economy itself, its dependence on walrus ivory, a luxury good that lost much of its European value once elephant ivory routes through Africa opened up in the 13th and 14th centuries. A settlement that had built its trade relationships, and perhaps its entire reason for remaining connected to Europe, around one resource may have found itself economically abandoned long before it was physically abandoned. Ships stopped coming not because the settlers vanished, but because there was less reason to visit, and less support arriving when it was needed most. Others have looked toward the Norse's neighbors. By the 13th century, the Thule people, ancestors of today's Inuit, had migrated into the same region the Norse occupied, and the archaeological record shows both contact and competition for resources, particularly in hunting grounds. Some sagas and later accounts describe conflict, though how much of that reflects real events versus later storytelling is difficult to untangle. Did tension over land and hunting rights play a role in the settlement's decline? It's possible. It's also possible the two groups coexisted far more than conflict narratives suggest, and that this explanation says more about how later writers wanted to frame the story than about what actually happened on the ground. Then there are theories that sit further from the mainstream, proposals that disease, brought inadvertently from Europe, moved through the settlement in a wave too fast for the surviving record to capture, or that a final catastrophic winter, one bad enough to break an already fragile system, did in a single season what decades of gradual cooling could not. These remain speculative, difficult to prove or disprove with the evidence currently available. But the speed implied by Barderson's account keeps them from being dismissed outright. What makes the Western settlement's disappearance different from Vinland's is the shape of the mystery itself. Vinland is a place we can't quite locate. The Western settlement is a place we know precisely. Its location is not in question. but its final months remain almost entirely unrecorded. We know where 200, perhaps more, human lives were lived. We don't know how they ended. Did the people of the Western settlement die where they stood, victims of famine or disease in a single terrible winter? Did they pack what they could carry and make their way south, toward the larger Eastern settlement, hoping for a future that history never documented? Did some of them, as a few researchers have speculated, integrate into Inuit communities, their descendants absorbed into a different way of life entirely? Ivar Barderson found empty houses and loose cattle. He did not find people, and he did not find bodies. 600 years later, neither have we. A letter arrived in Europe sometime around 1165, addressed to the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, and later circulated to the Pope and other Christian rulers. Its author identified himself as a king, not merely a king, but a priest-king, ruling over a vast Christian empire somewhere in the east, commanding armies beyond counting, presiding over a land of impossible wealth and stranger wonders. He called himself Prester John. The letter described a kingdom bordered by rivers running with gold dust, populated by griffins and phoenixes, home to a fountain of youth and a mirror that could see across the entire realm. It spoke of 72 vassal kings paying tribute, of an army that numbered in the millions, and it arrived at precisely the moment Europe needed it most. This was the era of the Crusades, a time when European Christendom felt itself surrounded, contesting territory in the Holy Land against forces that, from a European vantage point, seemed both vast and unified. The idea of a powerful Christian king somewhere beyond the Islamic world, someone who might one day march west and crush the forces opposing Christendom from the rear, was not just comforting. It was strategically intoxicating. Popes wrote letters seeking alliance. Explorers set out looking for his kingdom. And for nearly 400 years, European mapmakers kept a space open for him, shifting his location across the known world as each new expedition failed to find him where the last one had looked. The letter itself, historians largely agree, was almost certainly a forgery, a piece of political theater, possibly composed in Europe rather than sent from any distant king. No credible trace of Prester John exists in the historical record of any Eastern kingdom from that period, and yet the fabrication succeeded beyond anything its author likely intended. It didn't just circulate, it shaped foreign policy, funded expeditions, and outlived generations of the very rulers who first took it seriously. So who, if anyone, inspired it? The mainstream theories tend to look toward Central Asia. In 1141, a genuine and significant event occurred. A coalition led by the Qaraqatai, a Central Asian empire with roots connected to a fallen Chinese dynasty, decisively defeated the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Katwan. News of this victory, distorted and amplified as it traveled thousands of miles west through merchant routes and second-hand retellings, may have planted the seed of a powerful Eastern ruler capable of challenging Islamic forces. The Qaraqatai leader wasn't Christian, and the empire wasn't the paradise the letter described. But rumor rarely respects accuracy, and by the time the story reached Europe, it may have already transformed into something else entirely. Others point toward the Church of the East, often called Nestorian Christianity, which had, by the 12th century, spread far further into Asia than most Europeans realized. Christian communities existed among Mongol tribes in parts of Central Asia, even reaching into China. Was Prester John a garbled echo of these very real, very distant Christian populations? Proof, however distorted, that Christianity existed in places Europe assumed were entirely beyond its reach. When Central Asia failed to produce him, European attention didn't abandon the search. It redirected it. By the 14th century, mapmakers and travelers increasingly placed Prester John's kingdom in Ethiopia, home to one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world, with a documented history stretching back over 1,000 years, and no connection whatsoever to the original legend. Portuguese explorers, during the Age of Exploration, sailed with instructions to make contact with him specifically. They found the Ethiopian Empire, a real, powerful Christian kingdom with genuine diplomatic significance. What they didn't find was a king named Prester John, or a court, or a single ruler who claimed the title or resembled the letter's description. The legend had simply been relocated onto a country that happened to fit the shape of the story better than anywhere else had. By this point, a natural question emerges. Was Prester John ever meant to correspond to a single, real individual? Or had he become something else, a kind of cartographic placeholder onto which European hopes could be projected, moved across the map whenever reality failed to catch up with the myth? More speculative theories have proposed other candidates over the centuries. Mongol Khans, particularly during the early expansion of the Mongol Empire, when rumors of a powerful eastern ruler briefly seemed to align with the legend before the Mongols revealed themselves as conquerors rather than allies. A few researchers have even suggested the letter may have functioned less as misinformation and more as a deliberate piece of propaganda, crafted specifically to bolster crusading morale during a period of military setbacks. These ideas remain difficult to prove. The letter's true authorship has never been conclusively established, and likely never will be. What remains is a peculiar historical pattern. A fictional, or at minimum unverifiable, king who nonetheless shaped centuries of European exploration, diplomacy, and cartography. Real ships were launched, real alliances were pursued, and real maps were redrawn, all in service of a figure who may never have existed in any form resembling the letter that introduced him. Was Prester John a distorted memory of a real ruler, passed hand to hand until the truth wore away entirely? Was he a convenient fiction that took on a life its creators never anticipated? Or was he, in some sense, whatever Europe needed him to be at each stage of the search, reshaped, relocated, and reimagined until the man and the myth became impossible to separate? The letter still exists. The kingdom, as described, never did. What connects the two remains an open question. A blade rests under glass in a museum collection, its surface rippling with a pattern that looks almost liquid, bands of light and dark steel flowing across the metal like water frozen mid-current, or grain in a piece of ancient wood. Hold it at an angle and the pattern seems to shift. This is Damascus steel, and for nearly 1,000 years, it was among the most prized and most misunderstood materials on Earth. The name itself is something of a historical accident. The steel wasn't necessarily forged in Damascus at all. The city most likely served as a major trading hub where these blades were bought, sold, and encountered by European crusaders, who carried the name back with them and applied it to the material itself. What they were actually looking at was steel made from woots, a form of crucible steel produced primarily in India and Sri Lanka and traded throughout the Islamic world for centuries before reaching European hands. The blades earned their reputation honestly. Historical and modern accounts alike describe Damascus steel weapons as remarkably sharp, strong, and flexible in ways that European steel of the same era typically wasn't. Swordsmiths who wanted a blade capable of holding a keen edge while resisting shattering under stress had in woot steel a material that seemed to outperform what local techniques could produce. And it was beautiful. The rippling pattern, later called damask, wasn't decoration applied afterward. It was structural, emerging from the steel's internal composition itself, a signature written into the metal during its creation. And then, sometime in the 18th century, production simply stopped. The technique wasn't banned or lost in some singular catastrophic event. It faded. The woots ingots stopped being made in India in the quantities they once were. The trade routes that carried them shifted, and the specific knowledge required to forge them into pattern-welded blades faded along with the supply. By the time European scientists became seriously interested in understanding what made the steel unique, no one alive still knew how to make it. For over a century, that was where the story rested, until modern materials science began asking the harder question: what precisely had made woot steel behave the way it did? The mainstream explanation centers on carbon. Woot steel contained an unusually high carbon content, somewhere around 1 to 2%, compared to the significantly lower carbon content typical of contemporary European steel. Under the right forging conditions, this carbon formed microstructures, bands of cementite, an extremely hard iron-carbon compound distributed through a softer iron matrix. That combination is what produced both the pattern and the performance. The hard cementite bands provided a durable, sharp edge, while the surrounding matrix gave the blade the flexibility to absorb impact without fracturing. This explanation accounts for a great deal. It doesn't, however, fully account for the specific raw materials involved, or why later attempts to replicate the process using seemingly identical methods so often failed. This is where the picture gets stranger. In 2006, a team of German researchers examining an 17th century Wootz blade under electron microscopy found something unexpected embedded within its structure: carbon nanotubes, a material not officially discovered or understood by modern science until 1991. The nanotubes appeared to have formed around structures that were themselves the remnants of cementite nanowires, suggesting the ancient smiths had, apparently without any theoretical understanding of atomic structure, produced a steel containing nanoscale features that 20th century materials science initially believed to be entirely novel. Did the smiths know what they were doing at that level? Almost certainly not, in any scientific sense, but something in their specific combination of ore source, trace elements, and forging process consistently produced results that pure trial and error alone seems like an insufficient explanation for. Some researchers have pointed to the particular ores used. Certain Indian iron ore deposits contain trace amounts of elements like vanadium, which may have played a critical role in enabling the exact microstructure formation that gave the steel its properties. If the specific ore deposits were depleted or became inaccessible by the 18th century, that alone could explain why the technique couldn't simply be continued. That explanation, grounded in trace mineralogy and shifting trade access, remains the most widely accepted. But it hasn't stopped more speculative threads from persisting. Some have proposed that specific forging rituals or closely guarded techniques, passed down within particular smithing families or guilds, contain procedural steps essential to the outcome. Steps that, once those lineages ended without successors, were never written down or transmitted elsewhere. Others have wondered whether environmental factors during forging, water sources, fuel types, atmospheric conditions difficult to reconstruct today, played a larger role than modern replication attempts have accounted for. None of these ideas contradict the ore-based explanation outright. They simply suggest the full picture may involve more variables than any single factor can explain. Modern metallurgists have made real progress. Reproductions exist today that come close to replicating both the pattern and the mechanical properties of historical Wootz blades. Close, however, is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Even now, no modern process has fully and consistently reproduced the exact conditions, exact microstructure, and exact performance of the finest surviving historical examples. The blades remain in their cases, their surfaces still rippling under the light exactly as they did centuries ago. We understand today more about their internal chemistry than the smiths who forged them ever consciously did. And yet something in the full sequence, ore, fire, hand, and time, has never been perfectly recovered. What exactly went into the making of a blade this good? And why did the world let it disappear? If Wootz steel left science staring at nanotubes inside a centuries-old blade, Ethiopia offers something stranger still. Not hidden in the metal, but hidden underneath an entire town. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, at an elevation of roughly 2,500 meters, 11 churches sit carved, not built. They were not constructed stone by stone and raised upward. They were excavated downward, hollowed directly out of the solid volcanic rock of the mountain itself. Each one a single continuous piece of bedrock chiseled from the outside in, then hollowed from the inside out, until nothing remained but a fully formed church standing in a pit of its own negative space. This is Lalibela, and the scale of what stands there is difficult to fully absorb even in person. The largest of the churches, Beit Medhain Alem, is believed to be among the largest monolithic rock-hewn structures on Earth, an entire building carved from a single mass of stone, complete with columns, roof, windows, and interior chambers, all removed from what was once solid rock, rather than assembled from separate pieces. Tradition holds that the complex was built during the reign of King Gebre Meskel Lalibela in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, a project so vast in scope that popular legend insists it couldn't have been completed by human hands alone, claiming angels descended each night to continue the work after the human laborers went to sleep. Historians naturally look for more grounded explanations, and much of the historical context is genuinely well documented. King Lalibela reportedly undertook the project during a period when overland pilgrimage to Jerusalem had become dangerous and difficult, following the city's fall to Saladin's forces in 1187. The king's ambition, according to tradition, was to construct a new Jerusalem in the Ethiopian highlands, a holy destination close enough for his own people to reach, so pilgrimage would no longer require the perilous journey north. The church's names reinforce this directly. One is called Golgotha, another Bethlehem, echoes of biblical geography deliberately reproduced in Ethiopian stone. Even the river running through the complex was renamed the River Jordan. That much is reasonably well accepted. What remains far more contested is how, exactly, the labor was accomplished, and what, if anything, still lies beneath it. Engineers and archaeologists who have studied the site note that the excavation techniques involved were staggeringly labor-intensive, even by generous estimates. Workers would have needed to carve not just downward into the rock, but with enough precision to leave standing structural elements, pillars, arches, windows, mid-process, all while working from the outside of a shape that didn't yet exist, essentially sculpting a building in reverse. Modern estimates for the labor required range enormously, from a few decades to well over a century, depending on assumptions about workforce size and tools available. Local tradition insists the entire complex was completed within 23 years, a timeline many researchers consider implausible given the tools available in 12th century Ethiopia, though not one that's been definitively disproven either. Then there is the matter of what connects the churches to each other. The complex isn't simply 11 isolated structures. It's threaded together by an extensive network of tunnels, trenches, and underground passageways, some of which remain only partially explored to this day. Local guides and religious authorities have long spoken of chambers beneath the churches that go unmentioned in most official surveys. Spaces used, according to tradition, for storage, for burial, or for purposes lost to time. Ground-penetrating surveys conducted by various research teams over the decades have identified structural anomalies and voids beneath portions of the complex that don't correspond to any mapped or publicly accessible passage. Whether these represent additional undiscovered chambers, natural geological formations, or simply unexcavated extensions of the known tunnel network is, as of now, unresolved. This uncertainty has fed more speculative theories, circulating for generations among certain researchers and local oral traditions alike. Claims that the underground network at Lalibela may extend far beyond the 11 churches themselves, potentially connecting to other religious sites throughout the region, or containing sealed chambers never opened in the modern era. Some of the more fringe proposals suggest these hidden spaces might hold artifacts of major historical or religious significance, hidden deliberately during periods of regional conflict when the site's treasures needed protection. None of these claims have been substantiated by controlled excavation, and Ethiopian religious authorities have historically been protective of the site, limiting the scope of invasive archaeological investigation out of respect for its status as an active place of worship, meaning large portions of what may exist beneath Lalibela remain, quite literally, unexplored by design rather than by accident. What is certain is this: the churches above ground are real, staggering in their scale, and represent an engineering achievement that still challenges modern understanding of what was possible with 12th and 13th century tools and labor. What lies beneath them, in the tunnels only partially mapped and the chamber's ground-penetrating radar has only begun to hint at, remains an open question. One that Ethiopia's own religious traditions may be, deliberately, in no hurry to answer. If Lalibela's builders left messages, treasures or simply more of themselves in the rock beneath the churches, they may still be waiting there, undisturbed, exactly where they were left. Somewhere beneath the streets of Old Cairo, or perhaps scattered across a dozen collections that never knew what they held, may lie the remnants of what was once described as the greatest library the medieval world had ever assembled. Larger, by some contemporary accounts, than even the fabled Library of Alexandria at its height. Its name was Dar al-Ilm, the House of Knowledge, and its story doesn't end in a single dramatic fire. It ends in something far harder to reconstruct. A slow, deliberate dispersal, carried out not by an invading army, but by the very people entrusted to protect it. The Fatimid Caliphate rose to power in the 10th century, eventually establishing Cairo as its capital and building it into one of the intellectual centers of the Islamic world. Under Fatimid rule, and particularly under the Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah in the early 11th century, Dar al-Ilm was founded as a combination library, academy, and research institution, open, according to historical accounts, not only to Muslim scholars but to Christians and Jews as well, offering free access to texts on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and theology. Contemporary chroniclers describe a collection that ran into the hundreds of thousands of volumes, possibly over 1 million by some later and more disputed estimates, including irreplaceable original manuscripts, scientific treatises, and works of literature that existed nowhere else in the world at that time. For roughly a century and a half, the institution thrived, drawing scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond, becoming a genuine center of gravity for medieval learning during a period when much of Europe had far more limited access to preserved classical and scientific knowledge. And then, in 1171, the Fatimid Caliphate fell. Its conqueror, Saladin, the same military leader whose capture of Jerusalem would later prompt King Lalibela's own building project in Ethiopia, did not, according to most historical accounts, order the library burned in some singular act of destruction. What happened instead was, in some ways, more troubling to historians precisely because it was so mundane. Saladin, establishing the Ayyubid dynasty in the Fatimids' place, and seeking to consolidate a distinctly Sunni religious authority over what had been a Shia Ismaili caliphate, appears to have systematically dismantled the Fatimid intellectual infrastructure they had built. Historical accounts describe books being sold off, in some cases reportedly by the cartload, to merchants, scholars, and private buyers across Cairo. Other portions were reportedly repurposed entirely, used, according to some later chronicles, as material for bookbinding, or simply left to decay in storage as their custodianship dissolved along with the state that had maintained them. This is where verified history begins to blur into genuine uncertainty. Exactly how large the collection truly was remains disputed, since contemporary accounts vary wildly and were often written to either glorify or diminish Fatimid achievements depending on the political sympathies of the author. What is generally agreed upon is that the dispersal was real, that it happened over years rather than in a single event, and that an enormous quantity of unique manuscripts, works that may have represented the only surviving copies of certain scientific or philosophical texts from the ancient and early medieval world, simply scattered into private hands, regional libraries, and, in many cases, obscurity, which raises a question historians have never been able to fully answer. Where did it all go? Some texts almost certainly survived, absorbed into other great libraries across the Islamic world, in cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Baghdad, their Fatimid origins eventually forgotten as they were recatalogued under new custodianship over the following centuries. A number of manuscripts bearing Fatimid provenance markings have surfaced over the centuries in library collections across the Middle East and even in Europe, suggesting fragments of Dar al-Ilm's holdings did, in fact, survive the dispersal, just not as a unified collection and not always with their origins traceable. But the more speculative question, one that is periodically resurfaced among historians and manuscript researchers, involves what might still be sitting unidentified. Medieval library collections were not always carefully catalogued by origin, and provenance research on Islamic manuscripts remains even today a genuinely incomplete field. Could texts originally housed in Dar al-Ilm exist today in major archives, misattributed or simply unexamined closely enough to reveal their true origin? Some researchers have pointed to references, found in later medieval bibliographies, to specific rare scientific or astronomical texts once held at the Fatimid library, works that don't appear to correspond to any manuscript known to survive today. Were these genuinely lost, destroyed in the dispersal, or the centuries of instability that followed? Or are they sitting, uncatalogued and unrecognized, somewhere in a collection that has simply never connected the document in its possession to the institution it originally came from? There is no fire to point to, no singular villain, no dramatic final scene, just a great collection of human knowledge that came apart slowly, sold and scattered by people who likely never intended, or perhaps never fully understood, what they were dismantling. What survived, and where it survived to, remains only partially mapped. Somewhere, perhaps, a manuscript still sits on a shelf, its true origin unrecognized, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question about where it came from. Off the eastern shore of Pohnpei, in the Federated States of Micronesia, nearly 100 artificial islands rise out of a shallow lagoon, connected by canals that once earned the site its nickname among early European visitors, the Venice of the Pacific. This is Madol, and unlike Lalibela's churches, carved from a single mountain, or Dar al-Ilm's manuscripts, scattered by human hands, Madol presents an entirely different kind of impossibility. Not disappearance, but sheer, almost incomprehensible accumulation. The structures here are built from columns of basalt, a naturally occurring volcanic rock that forms in long hexagonal and pentagonal prisms, not unlike architectural material at all in its raw state. Somehow, generations of builders stacked these columns log cabin style, layer upon layer, into walls that in places rise more than 25 feet high, forming platforms, tombs, and enclosures across nearly 100 artificial islets, covering almost half a square mile of reef and lagoon. The largest structure, Nandawaz, is believed to have served as a royal mortuary complex, its walls enclosing burial chambers for the ruling Saudeleur dynasty that once governed the region. The engineering challenge alone is staggering. Researchers estimate that the total weight of basalt moved to construct Madol may exceed 750,000 metric tons. The columns themselves, some weighing several tons individually, were quarried from basalt deposits elsewhere on Pohnpei, not from the immediate construction site, meaning each one had to be transported somehow across open water to reach the lagoon. Pohnpei had no draft animals. No wheel is known to have been in use. And yet layer after layer of multi-ton stone columns were moved, positioned, and stacked with enough precision to survive nearly 1,000 years of tropical storms, tidal action, and time. Local oral tradition offers its own answer, one recorded consistently across generations of Pohnpeian storytelling. The islets were raised not by ordinary labor, but through the sorcery of two brothers, Olisipa and Olosopa, who arrived from a distant land and used magic to make the massive stones fly into place. It's a detail worth sitting with, not as literal history, but as a kind of testimony in itself. A story shaped, generation after generation, by people who understood exactly how difficult the construction they were looking at actually was, and who never quite settled on an explanation of ordinary labor being sufficient to account for it. Archaeologists working from radiocarbon dating and excavated material place the beginning of construction at Madol, sometime around the 8th or 9th century AD, with the most intensive building phase, the one responsible for the massive basalt structures visible today, occurring later, likely between the 12th and 13th centuries, under the authority of the Saudeleur dynasty. This timeline is reasonably well supported. What remains far less settled is the question of labor and organization. How, precisely, a Pacific Island society without draft animals, without the wheel, and without metal tools coordinated a construction project on this scale. The leading explanation involves simple, sustained human effort. Log rollers, rafts, and coordinated group labor, potentially involving the majority of Pohnpei's population over an extended period, moving basalt columns via canoe and raft during specific tidal or seasonal windows that would have made transport marginally more manageable. This theory doesn't require anything beyond known Pacific Islander capabilities, and comparable feats of coordinated stone moving are documented elsewhere in Oceania and around the world, including, famously, on Rapa Nui. But some researchers have noted that the scale and speed implied by construction timelines at Nan Madol still push the upper boundary of what similar labor forces are known to have accomplished elsewhere, raising the question of whether some technique, or some element of the organizational structure behind the labor, remains unaccounted for in the current model. A smaller number of geologists have proposed an intriguing possibility that doesn't rely on any lost technology or supernatural intervention: that some of the basalt columns may not have been quarried and transported at all, but rather formed naturally in place or nearly in place through localized volcanic activity, meaning the builder's task, while still immense, might have involved somewhat less long-distance transport than the fully manual model assumes. This remains a minority position, and most current geological surveys of the primary quarry sites on Pompeii do support long-distance transport as the dominant explanation. But the theory hasn't been entirely ruled out for every structure across the complex. Then there is the deeper, unresolved question of purpose and abandonment. Nan Madol was, by most accounts, a ceremonial and elite residential center, home to perhaps 1,000 people at its height, primarily nobility, priests, and those who served them, rather than the general population of Pompeii. Oral tradition holds that the Saudeleur dynasty's rule ended with an invasion led by a figure named Isokalekal, sometime in the 17th century, after which Nan Madol's political and ceremonial significance declined, and the site was gradually left to the encroaching mangroves and rising water that partially reclaim it today. Why a construction project of this magnitude, sustained over centuries, was ultimately allowed to fall into disuse rather than maintained or repurposed remains a question oral history addresses more confidently than archaeology can currently confirm. What stands today is a set of ruins that continue to challenge assumptions about what a stateless, pre-industrial Pacific society was capable of organizing and achieving. The stones are real. Their weight is measurable. Their positions are exact. What remains unmeasured is the full method and the full will that put them there. In 1025 AD, a fleet unlike anything Southeast Asia had seen departed from the eastern coast of India under the command of the Chola Emperor, Rajendra Chola I. Its target was Srivijaya, a maritime empire that controlled the Strait of Malacca, and, with it, a staggering share of the trade flowing between China and the West. What happened next is one of the best documented naval campaigns of the medieval Indian Ocean world, and also one of its more quietly unresolved chapters, precisely because so much of what made the campaign possible, and so much of what happened to its spoils afterward, was never fully recorded at all. The Chola dynasty, by the early 11th century, had built one of the most formidable naval powers in the medieval world, a fact reflected in inscriptions, temple records, and Chinese court documents that describe Chola embassies arriving with considerable wealth and ceremony. Rajendra Chola's campaign against Srivijaya wasn't a raid. Tamil inscriptions, most notably the Thanjavur inscriptions, describe the capture of numerous Srivijayan ports and territories across the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, including the Srivijayan capital itself, along with its ruler, Sangrama Vijayotunga Varman. This was, by the standards of the era, a full-scale conquest of one of the wealthiest trading networks on Earth, one that controlled the flow of spices, textiles, and luxury goods between two of the largest economies in the medieval world. And this is where the confidence of the historical record begins to thin. The Tamil inscriptions that document the campaign are, by design, celebratory rather than administrative. They confirm the scale of the victory and list the territories brought under Chola influence, but they say remarkably little about what followed logistically, how the wealth of a conquered trading empire, tribute, cargo, plundered goods from ports that had spent generations accumulating maritime trade revenue, was transported back across the Bay of Bengal, or what portion of it ever actually reached the Chola capital at Thanjavur. Contemporary temple donation records from the period do show a marked increase in gold and luxury offerings during Rajendra Chola's reign, suggesting some considerable wealth did flow back into Chola territory. But the precise accounting, the kind of detailed inventory a modern historian might hope for, simply doesn't survive if it was ever kept in that form at all. Chinese court records offer another thread, one that raises its own quiet questions. Song Dynasty chronicles document Chola diplomatic missions arriving in China both before and after the Srivijaya campaign, describing gifts and tribute of considerable value. But the intervals between documented missions and the sometimes inconsistent descriptions of what those missions carried have left historians without a fully continuous picture of exactly how Chola maritime wealth moved through the region during this period, and how consistently the empire's naval resources were deployed for trade versus military purposes in the years immediately following the conquest. Some of this ambiguity is simply the ordinary condition of medieval history. Record-keeping across any 11th century empire was inconsistent, and inscriptions serving political and religious purposes were never intended to function as complete ledgers. But it has left an opening for more speculative reconstruction. Maritime archaeologists working in the Bay of Bengal and along the Coromandel coast have long noted that, despite the scale of Chola naval activity during this period, confirmed shipwreck sites directly attributable to the Chola fleet remain remarkably rare, a gap some attribute simply to the difficulty of underwater archaeology in the region, and others have wondered about more directly. Were losses at sea, storms, piracy, the ordinary hazards of a return voyage carrying substantial cargo across open water ever significant enough to explain why the material record of Chola maritime wealth feels thinner than the textual record of Chola maritime power? A smaller number of researchers have pointed to something else entirely. The possibility that a portion of the wealth secured during the Srivijaya campaign never made the full journey back to the Chola heartland at all, but was instead redistributed, reinvested, or deposited at intermediate ports and temple complexes along the trade route, particularly at Chola-controlled sites in Sri Lanka and along the southeastern Indian coast, locations that served as waypoints for the fleet, and that, in some cases, show unexplained surges in temple construction and endowment during this exact period. This remains a genuinely speculative connection, one that hasn't been confirmed through direct archaeological linkage, but the timing, in several documented cases, is difficult to dismiss outright. What survives with certainty is the scale of the ambition. An Indian Ocean empire that projected naval power across thousands of miles of open water conquered one of the wealthiest trading states of its era, and returned home to inscriptions boasting of the achievement in unambiguous terms. What survives with far less certainty is the material afterlife of that conquest. Where the wealth actually went, how completely it was accounted for, and whether the quiet gaps in the record reflect nothing more than the ordinary limits of medieval documentation, or something that was, for reasons no longer recoverable, deliberately left unrecorded. Somewhere between Thanjavur and the Strait of Malacca, a great deal of Srivijaya's wealth changed hands in 1025. Exactly how much of it arrived where the inscriptions claim it did remains, in the fullest sense, an open question. In the ruins of Ghazni, in what is now eastern Afghanistan, two towers rise from the plain like the last standing pillars of a palace long since swallowed by dust. They are minarets, star-shaped and covered in intricate brickwork, and they are, in a very real sense, the ghost markers of an empire that once possessed one of the largest concentrations of looted wealth the medieval world had ever seen. Wealth that, by the time the empire itself collapsed, had almost entirely vanished from the historical record. The Ghaznavid Empire rose to power in the late 10th century, and under its most famous ruler, Mahmud of Ghazni, it became infamous for a very specific pattern of conquest. 17 documented military campaigns into the Indian subcontinent between roughly 1000 and 1027 AD, many of them targeting the subcontinent's wealthiest temple complexes. Contemporary Persian and Arab chroniclers, writing both during and shortly after Mahmud's reign, describe staggering hauls of gold, silver, and jewels seized from temple treasuries, most famously from the Somnath Temple in Gujarat in 1025, an event described in period sources with numbers so large that modern historians treat many of the specific figures with appropriate caution, while still accepting that the underlying scale of the plunder was genuinely enormous by the standards of the era. This wealth funded something remarkable. Ghazni, under Mahmud, became one of the great cultural capitals of the Islamic world, drawing scholars, poets, and scientists, including the polymath al-Biruni, whose surviving works remain foundational sources for understanding the history and geography of the region during this period. Contemporary accounts describe a court of extraordinary opulence, libraries, gardens, and architecture funded directly by the campaigns into India. For a brief period, Ghazni rivaled Baghdad and Cairo as a center of Islamic learning and material wealth. And then, within roughly a century and a half of Mahmud's death, the empire that built it collapsed, and with it, the trail of its accumulated treasure grows remarkably difficult to follow. The mainstream explanation for the empire's decline is reasonably well documented. The Ghaznavids faced sustained military pressure from the Seljuk Turks beginning in the 1030s, lost significant territory in Khorasan, and were eventually reduced to a much smaller regional power centered on Ghazni and parts of the Punjab. The final blow came in 1151 when the Ghurids, a rival dynasty from central Afghanistan, sacked Ghazni itself so thoroughly that Persian chroniclers writing afterward referred to the destruction using language typically reserved for cities considered entirely erased from significance, an event sometimes called, in later retellings, the burning that turned the city into what one chronicler described as a place fit only for foxes. That the city was thoroughly destroyed is not in serious dispute. What remains genuinely unresolved is what happened to the wealth that had been accumulating there for over a century. Court treasuries on the scale contemporary sources describe for Mahmud's Ghazni don't simply cease to exist, and yet no comparable concentration of Ghaznavid-attributed treasure has ever been definitively recovered, either through archaeological excavation at Ghazni itself, or through documented redistribution into any successor state's records. Some historians point to the most straightforward explanation available, that the wealth was gradually spent down over the century and a half between Mahmud's death and the Ghurid sack, funding the ongoing wars against the Seljuks, the maintenance of a shrinking but still costly court, and the general expenses of an empire increasingly on the defensive. Under this reading, there may simply be no missing treasure at all, only a slow depletion that outpaced the empire's ability to replenish it through further conquest once the Indian campaigns became less frequent under Mahmud's successors. But this explanation sits somewhat uneasily against the specific accounts of the 1151 sack itself, several of which describe the Ghurid forces spending days looting the city before burning it, descriptions that at least imply a treasury still substantial enough, more than a century after Mahmud's death, to be worth that level of attention. If a significant portion of the original wealth had already been spent down by that point, what exactly were the Ghurids carrying away in such quantity? And where, in turn, did that wealth go once it left Ghazni in Ghurid hands, a dynasty whose own historical record over the following decades is itself relatively sparse on the specific fate of major seized assets? This gap has fed more speculative lines of inquiry over the years, largely circulating among regional historians and treasure researchers, rather than mainstream academic archaeology. Some have proposed that portions of the original Ghaznavid wealth, particularly items considered too closely tied to specific temple origins to be easily liquidated or displayed, may have been deliberately hidden or buried during periods of military threat, potentially including the years immediately preceding the final Ghurid assault, when the outcome may have seemed increasingly inevitable to those inside the city. No confirmed cache matching this description has ever been documented by controlled excavation, and the ruins of Ghazni, while studied, have never been subject to the kind of exhaustive archaeological survey applied to some other major medieval capitals, in part due to decades of regional instability that have made sustained fieldwork difficult. What remains standing are the minarets, and the historical record of a city that briefly held one of the greatest concentrations of wealth in the medieval Islamic world before that wealth, along with much of the city itself, was scattered by successive waves of conquest, whose own final accounting was never fully written down. The towers still cast their shadows across the plain each afternoon, precisely as they have for nearly 1,000 years. What they once stood beside, in full, has never been fully found. In the hills of southeastern Zimbabwe, dry stone walls rise in sweeping curves across the landscape, built without a single trace of mortar, the granite blocks cut and stacked with such precision that some sections still stand nearly 9 meters high, over 8 centuries after they were laid. This is Great Zimbabwe, the largest stone structure built in sub-Saharan Africa before the modern era, and for much of the 20th century, colonial authorities in the region insisted it couldn't possibly have been built by the ancestors of the people living around it, attributing it instead to Phoenicians, Arabs, or a vanished white civilization, theories that archaeology has since thoroughly and repeatedly disproven. Excavated pottery, radiocarbon dating, and architectural continuity all confirm what oral tradition maintained the entire time. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people, beginning around the 11th century AD, reaching its height between the 13th and 15th centuries. That settled question, though, has opened onto a genuinely unresolved one. Not who built Great Zimbabwe, but what came immediately before it, and how directly connected that earlier world actually was. Great Zimbabwe wasn't an isolated achievement. It was the largest and most famous of what archaeologists now recognize as more than 200 related stone-walled sites scattered across the region, collectively part of what's sometimes called the Zimbabwe culture, a network of settlements sharing architectural style, trade connections, and likely political affiliation. But before this network fully emerged, an earlier state existed in the region, one archaeologists call Mapungubwe, centered near the confluence of the Limpopo and Shashe rivers, flourishing roughly between the 11th and 13th centuries, its capital abandoned right around the period Great Zimbabwe began its most significant phase of construction. Mapungubwe is, in its own right, remarkable. Excavations there uncovered evidence of a highly stratified society, including a hilltop burial containing a small rhinoceros figurine crafted from gold foil, alongside other gold artifacts indicating both metalworking skill and access to long-distance trade networks reaching the Swahili coast, and, from there, into the broader Indian Ocean trading world. Glass beads recovered at the site, sourced from as far as the Middle East and South Asia, confirm Mapungubwe's participation in the same trade routes that, elsewhere in the story of this era, carried Chola wealth across the Bay of Bengal and Fatimid manuscripts across the Islamic world. And then Mapungubwe was abandoned, seemingly within a relatively short window, sometime in the early to mid-13th century. The mainstream explanation points to climate. Paleoclimate studies of the region suggest the Little Ice Age's onset brought a significant sustained drying trend to the Limpopo Valley during this period, reducing the agricultural capacity that had supported Mapungubwe's population and likely contributing directly to its decline, potentially pushing both population and political authority northward toward the higher rainfall plateau where Great Zimbabwe would soon rise to prominence. This climate-driven migration theory is well supported by environmental data and fits the observed timeline reasonably well. What it doesn't fully resolve is the question of continuity. How much of Mapungubwe's population, political structure, and specific cultural practices transferred directly into what became Great Zimbabwe, versus how much of Great Zimbabwe's rise represented a genuinely separate development among related but distinct Shona-speaking communities already established on the plateau before Mapungubwe's decline. Archaeologists broadly agree the two sites are culturally related, sharing certain artifact styles and clear trade continuities. But the precise mechanism, whether an outright migration of ruling elites, a gradual shift in trade and political gravity, or something more complex involving multiple overlapping communities, remains a subject of ongoing academic debate rather than settled consensus. There's a further layer of uncertainty sitting beneath even that question. Excavations at both Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe have been complicated by their own troubled histories. Early 20th century excavations, particularly at Mapungubwe, were conducted under the racial ideologies of the era, sometimes hastily, sometimes with inadequate documentation, and in some cases with material removed from the sites without the kind of careful stratigraphic recording that would allow modern researchers to fully reconstruct the sequence of occupation. Some artifacts from these early excavations were reportedly kept hidden from public knowledge for decades, specifically because they undermined the colonial-era narratives being promoted at the time, only gaining wider recognition after South Africa's political transition in the 1990s. This means a portion of the archaeological record that might otherwise help answer the continuity question has been permanently compromised or lost, not by time, but by the specific circumstances under which it was originally excavated. What precisely happened in the decades between Mapungubwe's decline and Great Zimbabwe's rise to regional dominance? Did a single ruling lineage relocate northward, carrying political legitimacy and trade relationships with them in a relatively direct transfer of power? Or did Great Zimbabwe emerge more independently, built by related communities who absorbed Mapungubwe's trade networks and some of its cultural practices without a direct line of political succession connecting the two? The stone walls of Great Zimbabwe stand as confirmed, undeniable proof of what Shona ancestors were capable of building. What remains less certain is the fuller story of the world that came immediately before it, and precisely how one gave way to the other. Beneath the drying hills near the Limpopo, and beneath the sweeping granite walls further north, that transition is still being pieced together, one excavation and one re-examined artifact at a time. At dawn, before the heat settles over the Cambodian plain, the 5 towers of Angkor Wat emerge first as silhouette, then as detail. Thousands of meters of bas-relief unfolding across sandstone galleries, depicting armies, gods, and the churning of a cosmic ocean, all carved by hands that left behind one of the most extensive visual records in the ancient world, and almost no written account of themselves at all. This is the central paradox of Angkor Wat, and of the broader Khmer Empire that built it. A civilization capable of raising the largest religious monument on Earth, covering some 162 hectares, larger than many ancient cities, while leaving remarkably little in the way of administrative or personal documentation explaining precisely how the work was organized, who oversaw it day to day, or what became of the vast labor force once construction ended. The temple itself is reasonably well dated. Inscriptions and architectural analysis place its construction during the reign of King Suryavarman II in the first half of the 12th century, originally built as a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu before gradually transitioning to Buddhist use in the centuries that followed. This much is settled. Modern engineering surveys have confirmed the sheer scale of material involved. An estimated 5 to 10 million sandstone blocks, some weighing over a ton, quarried primarily from the Kalen Hills, roughly 40 kilometers away, and transported to the construction site via a network of canals specifically engineered to move stone across that distance, since Cambodia's flat terrain offered no easier alternative. What's missing is almost everything else. Unlike contemporary civilizations in India, China, or the Islamic world, which left behind detailed court chronicles, tax records, and administrative correspondence, the Khmer Empire's surviving textual record consists almost entirely of stone inscriptions, most of them religious or dedicatory in nature, praising kings and gods rather than documenting logistics. The Khmer did have a writing system, and evidence suggests they also wrote on more perishable materials, palm leaf manuscripts and possibly other organic media, none of which survived Cambodia's tropical climate, where humidity and monsoon seasons degrade organic material within a matter of decades under normal conditions. If detailed administrative records of Angkor Wat's construction ever existed, and most historians believe they likely did, in some form, they simply didn't survive to be found. This absence leaves fundamental questions about the construction process resting on inference rather than direct documentation. How large was the labor force actually required? Estimates derived from comparative studies and the sheer volume of material moved suggest tens of thousands of workers, quite possibly numbers approaching or exceeding 100,000 across the full span of construction and the Empire's broader building program, though these figures remain calculated rather than confirmed by any surviving Khmer administrative source. Were these workers primarily conscripted labor, drawn from agricultural communities during non-planting seasons as part of a broader system of corvée labor tied to religious devotion, a pattern documented in later, better recorded periods of Khmer history? Or did construction involve a more complex mixture of skilled artisans working alongside seasonal labor, organized through a bureaucratic structure whose specific mechanisms simply went unrecorded, or unrecorded in any medium that outlasted the empire itself? The famous bas-reliefs offer a strange kind of partial answer. Among their extensive depictions of mythology, historical battles, and processions of King Suryavarman II's court, a small number of panels appear to show scenes of ordinary daily life, markets, domestic activities, even what some scholars have interpreted as depictions of construction or quarrying work itself. But these images, while visually rich, weren't created as administrative documentation. They're religious and dynastic art, meant to glorify king and cosmos, and interpreting specific logistical detail from devotional carving carries obvious limits. The mystery deepens further when the question shifts from construction to abandonment. Angkor, the broader city surrounding the temple and the seat of Khmer imperial power, was one of the largest pre-industrial urban settlements in the world at its height, with some estimates, based on LiDAR surveys conducted over the past 2 decades, suggesting the greater Angkor region may have supported population densities and an urban footprint significantly larger than historians assumed even 20 years ago. And yet by the 15th century, the city had been substantially depopulated, its royal court relocated south, closer to modern Phnom Penh, leaving Angkor Wat itself to be maintained on a reduced scale, primarily as a Buddhist religious site, while the surrounding urban infrastructure gradually receded under jungle growth. The traditional explanation for Angkor's decline pointed to a single dramatic cause: military conquest, specifically a sacking by the Ayutthaya Kingdom in 1431. That event is historically documented and real. But more recent research, drawing heavily on the LiDAR surveys and associated paleoclimate studies conducted in the 2000s, has complicated this picture considerably. Tree ring and sediment data indicate the region experienced severe, alternating cycles of extreme drought and intense monsoon flooding during the 14th and early 15th centuries, placing enormous stress on Angkor's famously sophisticated water management system, an extensive network of reservoirs and canals that the city's agricultural base depended on entirely. Evidence of significant infrastructure damage and repair, followed by apparent system failure, has led many researchers to conclude that environmental and infrastructural collapse, not military defeat alone, may have been the primary driver of Angkor's decline, with the 1431 sacking representing something closer to a final blow against an already severely weakened capital, rather than the sole cause of its fall. This reframing doesn't fully resolve the question, though, so much as relocate it. If Angkor's water management system was sophisticated enough to sustain one of the largest cities in the pre-industrial world for centuries, what specific combination of engineering limitation, administrative decision-making, or unprecedented climate extremity ultimately overwhelmed it? Were there internal political factors, succession disputes, or administrative failures compounding the environmental pressure? Factors that, once again, an intact Khmer administrative record might have clarified, and that now can only be inferred from soil cores, satellite imagery, and the sparse language of religious inscription. Angkor Wat itself survived, remarkably intact, cared for continuously by Buddhist monks even as the city around it emptied, which is precisely why the temple could be reintroduced to the wider world in the 19th century as if freshly rediscovered, when in truth it had never been fully lost at all. What was lost, more precisely, was the voice of the empire that built it, the day-to-day record of decisions, labor, and administration that might explain, in the builder's own words, exactly how an empire without the wheel in common use, without draft animals suited to the terrain, and without a surviving bureaucratic archive, managed to raise the largest religious structure on the planet, and then, over the following centuries, quietly let the city around it go. In a chapel in Antioch in June of 1098, a Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew led a group of desperate, starving crusaders to a specific spot beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter and began to dig. What he claimed to find there, after hours of digging by torchlight in front of witnesses, was a spearhead, rusted and unremarkable to look at, which he identified as the Holy Lance, the very spear a Roman soldier had reportedly used to pierce the side of Christ during the crucifixion. Within days, a demoralized and besieged Crusader army, weeks from starvation and facing a much larger Muslim relief force outside Antioch's walls, rallied around the relic and won a battle many chroniclers described as decisive and nearly miraculous in turning the course of the entire First Crusade. What happened to that spearhead afterward, along with a considerable number of other relics the Crusaders claimed to recover during their campaign through the Levant, is where verified history gives way to a tangle of competing claims, lost provenance, and objects that, in some cases, still exist today, but whose journey from 1098 to the present remains only partially documented. The discovery of the Holy Lance was controversial even at the time. Peter Bartholomew's chief patron among the Crusader nobility, Raymond of Toulouse, championed the relic's authenticity, while other prominent leaders of the expedition, including the papal legate Adhemar of Le Puy, expressed skepticism from the outset, partly because a separate lance already claimed to be the authentic Holy Lance existed in Constantinople, and had for centuries. Peter Bartholomew's credibility suffered further after he insisted months later on undergoing an ordeal by fire to prove his visions were genuine, an event from which he emerged severely burned and died from his injuries roughly 2 weeks afterward, a death many contemporaries interpreted as evidence against the relic's authenticity, though Raymond of Toulouse continued to carry the lance with him for years afterward regardless. The Antioch lance's subsequent trail grows genuinely difficult to follow with confidence. Some accounts suggest Raymond eventually lost interest in publicly promoting it as his political fortunes shifted. Other relics associated with the First Crusade fared differently, and in some cases, more traceably. A fragment believed to be part of the True Cross, recovered by the Crusaders after their capture of Jerusalem in 1099. Became one of the most significant relics of the newly established Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, carried into numerous subsequent battles as a symbol of divine favor, most famously lost to Saladin's forces at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, a defeat that also led directly to Jerusalem's fall, and through several intervening steps of history already touched on in this exploration, indirectly inspired King Lalibela's own building project half a world away in Ethiopia. That particular relic fragment, the one carried at Hattin, was never recovered by Crusader forces afterward, despite documented attempts and, later, formal diplomatic requests to have it returned. Saladin's own court records and later Ayyubid sources make occasional, brief reference to relics taken as spoils during the battle, but no consistent or detailed account survives describing what specifically happened to this particular fragment in the years and decades that followed. Whether it was kept intact within Ayyubid or later Mamluk hands, broken apart and distributed, or simply lost amid the general chaos of the era's frequent regime changes across the region remains genuinely unresolved. This pattern, a relic prominently documented at the moment of its capture or discovery, followed by a slow fade into inconsistent or absent record-keeping, repeats across a surprising number of objects associated with the First Crusade specifically. Part of the explanation is structural rather than mysterious. Medieval relic culture operated within an economy where authenticity was frequently contested even by contemporaries, where multiple churches across Europe often claimed possession of the same relic simultaneously, and where the movement of sacred objects, through gift, theft, sale, or simple loss during the chaos of medieval warfare and travel, was common enough that even well-documented relics frequently accumulate genuine gaps in their provenance over centuries. But the specific case of First Crusade relics carries an additional layer of complexity, because the crusading states themselves, the Kingdom of Jerusalem chief among them, existed for less than 2 centuries before being fully dismantled, their archives and treasuries dispersed, destroyed, or absorbed by conquering forces across multiple waves of conflict throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. Unlike a long-lived monastic institution that might maintain unbroken custodial records for a relic across many centuries, the crusading state's relics were frequently displaced by exactly the kind of military and political upheaval that also destroys the paperwork tracking them. Some claimed First Crusade relics do have continuous traceable histories into the modern era, held today in European cathedral treasuries with documentation, however debated, stretching back centuries. Others exist only as textual references in chronicles, objects chroniclers describe as present at a specific battle or ceremony that simply stop appearing in any subsequent record, their eventual fate never mentioned again in any surviving source. Occasionally, an object surfaces in a later inventory, a cathedral treasury list, a private collection catalog, claiming a provenance connecting it back to the First Crusade, claims that range from plausible to essentially unverifiable given the intervening centuries and the sheer number of relics of dubious origin that circulated throughout medieval and early modern Europe. What remains genuinely open is less a single dramatic question than a pattern spread across dozens of individual objects. How many relics, genuinely recovered or claimed during the First Crusade's campaign through Anatolia and the Levant, still exist today, unrecognized, in collections that have simply lost the specific thread connecting a particular object back to 1098 or 1099? And how many were lost entirely, dispersed in the same slow, undramatic way that swallowed Dar el-Ilm's manuscripts, or the Ghaznavid treasury, not through a single catastrophic event, but through the accumulated erosion of centuries, regime change, and the simple fact that no one, at any given moment, was specifically responsible for keeping track. Somewhere in a treasury, a private collection, or a museum storeroom, an object recovered by starving crusaders outside Antioch or carried through the gates of a newly conquered Jerusalem may still exist. Whether anyone alive today could recognize it for what it once was is another matter entirely. Somewhere along the East African coast, buried beneath centuries of shifting sediment, mangrove growth, or possibly the waters of the Indian Ocean itself, lies a city that ancient geographers described in enough detail to convince us it was real, and yet precise enough location eludes archaeologists to this day. Its name, as recorded by Greek and Roman sources, was Rhapta, and it may have been the southernmost significant trading port known to the classical Mediterranean world, a place where ivory, tortoiseshell, and rhinoceros horn from the African interior met ships arriving from across the Indian Ocean, centuries before most of the sites already explored in this series had even been founded. The primary source for Rhapta's existence is a remarkable document called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a merchant's guide to Indian Ocean trade routes written by an anonymous Greek-speaking author, likely a working sailor or trader rather than a professional historian, probably composed sometime in the 1st century A.D. The Periplus describes Rhapta with the practical detail of someone who had genuinely been there, or spoken directly with those who had. A market town governed under the authority of a ruler based in southern Arabia, trading in ivory of exceptional quality, along with tortoiseshell and a small quantity of coconut oil, reached by sailing several days beyond a prominent cape the text calls the Cape of Spices. The Greek geographer Ptolemy, writing roughly a century later, also references Rhapta, describing it as a metropolis, a term suggesting a settlement of genuine size and regional importance rather than a minor trading post. This is, by ancient standards, a reasonably well-documented place. 2 independent classical sources describe it, roughly consistent in their general geography, both treating it as an established and significant point on the Indian Ocean trade network, one connected commercially all the way to southern Arabia, and through further trade relationships the Periplus describes elsewhere into the broader network eventually reaching India. And yet, despite more than a century of active archaeological interest, no site along the East African coast has been definitively confirmed as Rhapta. The search has not been for lack of trying. Candidate locations have been proposed across a considerable stretch of coastline, spanning parts of modern-day Tanzania and Kenya, with a cluster of research attention focused particularly around the Rufiji River Delta in Tanzania, an area whose geography, a substantial river mouth capable of supporting significant maritime trade, at least broadly matches the kind of location the classical descriptions imply. Some researchers have proposed the Pangani River area further north as an alternative candidate. Others have looked toward the Kenyan coast near the Tanay River. Each proposal has some degree of geographic plausibility. none has produced conclusive, widely accepted archaeological confirmation. Part of the difficulty is environmental, and genuinely severe. The East African coastline in the regions under consideration is dominated by shifting river deltas, mangrove ecosystems, and significant coastal erosion and sediment deposition over the intervening 2,000 years, meaning a coastal settlement from the 1st century AD could plausibly now sit meters underwater, buried under accumulated silt, or simply eroded away entirely by 2 millennia of tidal action and shifting river courses. Unlike Nan Madol's basalt columns, built from material that survives essentially indefinitely, or Angkor Wat's sandstone galleries, a trading settlement built primarily from more perishable materials, wood, thatch, packed earth, common building methods for the era and region, would leave a far fainter archaeological signature to begin with, one considerably more vulnerable to being erased entirely by exactly the kind of coastal geological processes that have reshaped this stretch of Africa's shoreline continuously since Rhapta's own era. Excavations conducted at several candidate sites, including work at Rufiji Delta locations, have recovered material evidence of ancient trade activity, including imported pottery and other artifacts consistent with Indian Ocean trade connections, dating to broadly the Right era. This confirms that trade of the kind the Periplus describes was genuinely occurring along this stretch of coast during the appropriate period. What it hasn't yet produced is a single site substantial enough and specifically identifiable enough to be confidently declared the metropolis Ptolemy described, as opposed to one of what may have been several smaller, related trading communities operating along the same general coastline and participating in the same broader network. This uncertainty has opened space for a genuinely wider range of proposals than most sites in this series have generated, precisely because the underlying evidence remains this thin. Some researchers have wondered whether Rhapta wasn't a single fixed settlement at all in the way later cities were, but rather a name applied somewhat loosely by classical geographers, working from second-hand sailor accounts, to what may have actually been a shifting or seasonal trading point, one that moved somewhat over time as river channels and coastal geography themselves shifted, meaning the search for one specific permanent buried city might be looking for something that never quite existed in that singular form to begin with. This remains a minority position, and most researchers still favor the idea of a genuine, identifiable urban settlement, but it illustrates how much interpretive latitude the sparse evidence currently allows. A separate, more speculative line of inquiry has focused on the relationship between Rhapta and the Southern Arabian authority the Periplus claims governed it, a detail suggesting significant, organized political and economic connections between the Arabian Peninsula and the East African coast far earlier than some traditional historical narratives have generally emphasized. If a Southern Arabian polity was genuinely capable of exercising formal authority over a trading settlement this far down the African coast in the 1st century AD, what does that imply about the scale and sophistication of Indian Ocean trade networks during this period more broadly? Connections potentially significant enough to warrant further scrutiny of exactly how much of the ancient world's commercial infrastructure in this ocean has gone entirely unrecovered by archaeology to date. What remains is a place named with confidence by 2 separate classical authors, describing trade goods, governance, and geography in specific enough detail to suggest genuine first-hand knowledge, and a stretch of East African coastline where the physical evidence of that place has simply not yet surfaced. Whether because it lies still buried, because it was long ago erased by the same rivers and tides that once made it valuable, or because the ancient world's own written record has, in some subtle way not yet fully understood, described a place slightly differently than it actually stood. Rhapta's ships once carried ivory across a sea that connected Africa to Arabia, and eventually to India. The port they sailed from remains, for now, exactly where the classical world left it, named, described, and still not found. Near the modern Swedish town of Gamla Uppsala, 3 enormous burial mounds rise from otherwise flat farmland, each one large enough to have taken a considerable workforce years to raise, each one dated to the 6th century AD, centuries before the events this particular mystery centers on. But it isn't the mounds themselves that have puzzled historians for the better part of 2 centuries. It's what one medieval chronicler claimed once stood beside them. A temple, gilded, adorned with golden chains draped across its roof, housing statues of Norse gods and the site of ritual sacrifices conducted, according to the account, every 9 years, drawing worshippers from across Scandinavia. No trace of that building has ever been conclusively found. The account comes from Adam of Bremen, a German cleric writing around 1075, roughly a generation after Christianity had become the dominant religion across most of Scandinavia. Adam never claimed to have visited Uppsala himself, working instead from second-hand reports, including testimony from a Danish king, making his description a document written at one remove from direct observation by an author with a clear institutional interest, as a churchman documenting the final holdouts of paganism in portraying the old religion in vivid, damning detail. His description of the temple is detailed to an almost suspicious degree. 3 wooden statues representing Thor, Odin, and Freyr, positioned within the structure, a nearby sacred grove where the bodies of sacrificial victims, both animal and reportedly human, were said to be hung from the trees, and a well beside the temple used for divination rituals involving submerging a living person and interpreting their survival or drowning as an omen. This is where verified archaeology and Adam's account begin to diverge in ways that have never been fully reconciled. Extensive excavations at Gamla Uppsala, conducted across multiple research campaigns from the 20th century through more recent work in the 2000s, have confirmed the site was genuinely significant. A major royal and ceremonial center for the Svear people, predecessors to the medieval Swedish kingdom, with clear evidence of elite settlement, feasting halls, and the burial mounds themselves, which excavations confirm did contain the cremated remains of high-status individuals along with substantial grave goods. What excavations have not definitively produced is unambiguous physical evidence of the specific gilded temple structure Adam describes, positioned exactly where his account implies it should be. The modern church at Gamla Uppsala, built during the medieval Christianization of the site, sits on a location many historians have long suspected occupies the same ground the pagan temple once stood on, a common pattern across converted regions, where Christian authorities frequently built directly atop the foundations of the religious sites they were replacing, both practically and symbolically. If Adam's temple genuinely stood where tradition places it, its remains may lie directly beneath a structure that has now itself stood, continuously, for close to 1,000 years, making the kind of unrestricted excavation that might resolve the question straightforwardly impossible without disturbing an active, historically significant church. Excavations conducted nearby, rather than directly beneath the church itself, have produced findings that complicate the picture further, rather than simplifying it. Archaeologists have identified the remains of large wooden hall structures at the site, some featuring unusually substantial post holes, suggesting significant monumental buildings, along with evidence of what may have been ceremonial activity. But whether any specific structure among these represents Adam's temple specifically, as opposed to a large feasting hall or royal residence serving overlapping ceremonial and political functions, a distinction that may have been considerably blurrier in practice during this period than Adam's account, written from a Christian perspective actively distinguishing sacred pagan space from secular space, implies, remains genuinely debated. This uncertainty extends to the darker elements of Adam's account as well. The claim of human sacrifice at Uppsala has never been definitively confirmed or disproven through archaeological evidence at the site itself, leaving historians divided on how literally to treat this specific detail. Some point to broader archaeological and textual evidence of ritual sacrifice, including human sacrifice, documented at other Norse and broader Germanic sites across northern Europe during the pagan period, suggesting Adam's account, even if exaggerated or embellished in specific details, may reflect a genuine underlying practice rather than pure Christian propaganda invented wholesale. Others note that medieval Christian authors writing about pagan religious practices had strong institutional motivation to emphasize precisely this kind of detail, whether or not it accurately reflected the specific rituals conducted at this specific site. making Adam's account, however vivid, difficult to treat as straightforward reportage rather than a text serving a clear rhetorical purpose. What is reasonably well documented is the site's eventual religious transition. Sweden's Christianization was a gradual, multi-generational process rather than a single decisive event, and Gamla Uppsala's significance as a pagan ceremonial center appears to have persisted longer than in many other parts of Scandinavia, with some historical accounts suggesting organized pagan worship and associated sacrificial practices continued at the site into the late 11th century, remarkably late compared to the broader Scandinavian Christianization timeline before the site was formally converted, with a Christian church eventually constructed there, and Uppsala transitioning into a significant seat of the new religion instead, eventually becoming the location of Sweden's first archbishopric. Whether that transition involved the literal destruction of Adam's golden temple, its gradual abandonment and decay, its deliberate dismantling with the materials repurposed elsewhere, a practice documented at other converted pagan sites across northern Europe, or whether the temple as Adam specifically described it, gilded roof, golden chains and all, was itself a partially embellished account layered onto a real but less ornately decorated ceremonial structure, is a question the current archaeological record simply cannot answer with confidence. The mounds at Gamla Uppsala remain, exactly where they've stood for 15 centuries, their contents at least partially understood through careful excavation. The temple that once, according to at least one medieval account, stood gleaming beside them, drawing worshippers from across the Norse world every 9 years for rituals whose full nature we may never completely reconstruct, remains considerably harder to pin down, possibly buried beneath a church that has occupied the same ground for centuries, possibly gone entirely, and possibly, in its most elaborate details, never quite as literal as the churchman who described it, working from stories told to him by others, wanted his readers to believe. Scattered across the fields and coastlines of eastern and northern Scotland stand more than 200 carved stones, their surfaces covered in symbols that have never been fully deciphered. Crescents crossed by broken arrows, mirror and comb motifs, serpents, and stylized animals rendered with startling anatomical confidence, alongside creatures that correspond to nothing found in the natural world at all. These are Pictish stones, the most substantial physical legacy of a people who dominated much of Scotland for close to 1,000 years, and who, by the 10th century, had stopped being called Picts by anyone at all. The Picts first appear in the historical record through Roman sources, with the name itself, likely derived from Latin, meaning roughly the painted ones, possibly referencing body art or tattooing practices the Romans observed among the tribal confederations north of Hadrian's Wall. From the 3rd century onward, Pictish kingdoms emerged as a genuine political force, successfully resisting Roman conquest of northern Scotland entirely, and later consolidating into increasingly organized kingdoms that by the early medieval period controlled territory stretching from the Northern Isles down through much of modern Scotland north of the Forth. For a people this historically significant, contemporaries occupying the same challenging position other groups in this series have held, a documented, formidable presence with an extensive material record, the Picts left behind a puzzle that has occupied historians and linguists for well over a century. Nobody has ever conclusively deciphered their written language, if the symbol stones even represent language in the way that term is typically understood. The symbols themselves are undeniably systematic. The same core set of motifs, several dozen distinct symbols, appears repeatedly across stones separated by considerable geographic distance, frequently combined in pairs or small groups, following patterns consistent enough that most researchers agree they represent some form of organized communication rather than purely decorative art. What that communication actually conveyed, however, remains genuinely unresolved. Proposed interpretations have included personal names, recording specific individuals or marriages, particularly given some scholars' observations that symbol pairings may function similarly to how genealogical or dynastic markers operate in other early medieval cultures. Territorial or clan markers, or a form of proto-heraldry establishing status or lineage. A smaller number of researchers have argued the symbols may constitute an actual writing system encoding the Pictish language directly, rather than a symbolic or heraldic code layered separately on top of it, though this remains a minority position, complicated significantly by the fact that the Pictish language itself is only very fragmentarily attested and imperfectly understood. This linguistic uncertainty compounds the difficulty considerably. The Picts did leave behind a small number of inscriptions using Ogham, a script originally developed in Ireland, primarily consisting of lines carved along a central axis representing letters. Several dozen Ogham inscriptions have been found on Pictish stones, and in theory, Ogham script can be read phonetically, the same way any alphabetic script can. In practice, when scholars have applied phonetic Ogham readings to Pictish inscriptions, the resulting words frequently don't correspond clearly to any known language, Celtic or otherwise, leading to genuine ongoing academic debate about whether Pictish represented a distinct, non-Indo-European language that has left no other written trace and no direct descendants, a heavily divergent Celtic language sufficiently different from its neighbors to resist straightforward interpretation, or whether the difficulty lies not with the underlying language, but with scribes applying an imported script never originally designed for Pictish phonetics to begin with, producing transcriptions that were awkward and difficult to parse even for contemporary readers. Layered on top of the unresolved symbol stones and undeciphered inscriptions sits the second half of this mystery, the question embedded directly in this chapter's title. What actually happened to the Picts as a distinct people and political entity? The traditional, more dramatic framing of this question, popular in older historical writing, treated Pictish disappearance as something close to a literal vanishing, a distinct people and culture that simply ceased to exist within a relatively short window during the 9th and 10th centuries. Modern historians have moved considerably away from that framing, and the underlying reason is well documented. The Pictish kingdoms gradually merged with neighboring Gaelic-speaking Dal Riata, most notably under Synead MacAilpin, known in later tradition as Kenneth MacAlpin in the mid-9th century, forming what would become the Kingdom of Alba, the direct political ancestor of medieval and modern Scotland. This much is reasonably well established as straightforward political consolidation rather than mysterious disappearance. What remains genuinely less clear is the specific cultural mechanism behind how thoroughly and how quickly Pictish identity, language, and symbolic tradition were absorbed and effectively erased within that new Gaelic-dominated political structure, to the point that within roughly a century, no one was producing new Pictish symbol stones. No chronicler was writing in the Pictish language, and the very term Pict survived primarily as a historical label applied by outsiders and later writers, rather than a living self-identification. Was this assimilation primarily a matter of elite political consolidation? A Gaelic-speaking royal dynasty simply absorbing Pictish territory and administration, while the broader population's language and customs shifted more gradually over subsequent generations, following the aristocracy's lead over time? Or did something more actively suppressive occur during this consolidation? A deliberate marginalization of Pictish language, religious practice, and symbolic tradition by the new Gaelic political order. A process some historians have proposed, but which the surviving record, sparse on both sides of this transition, cannot fully confirm or rule out. The genuine unevenness of the evidence, extensive material culture in the symbol stones, remarkably thin surviving textual record in the Picts' own words, or in words we can confidently identify as their own, means this question remains open in a way that pure political history alone doesn't resolve. The stones themselves still stand across the Scottish landscape, their crescents and serpents and mirror symbols facing weather they faced for well over 1,000 years, carrying what may be names, titles, or entire sentences in a language largely lost to us now. Whoever carved them expected presumably to be understood. Whether that understanding could ever be fully recovered, or whether the Picts' own voice, buried somewhere in stone symbols no one has yet cracked, is simply waiting for the right combination of evidence and insight to finally speak again, remains, like so much of what came before them in this exploration, an open question standing quietly in a field. In the crypt of Burgos Cathedral, beneath a soaring Gothic nave that took centuries to complete, a marble slab marks the resting place of Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, the Castilian nobleman better known to history and legend alike as El Cid. Pilgrims and tourists file past it today with reasonable confidence they're standing near the genuine remains of medieval Iberia's most famous warrior. What far fewer of them know is that the bones beneath that slab reached Burgos only after a journey scattered across nearly 9 centuries, multiple exhumations, at least one documented theft, and a final resting place that even now rests on a chain of custody historians can only partially verify. El Cid's real biography is, remarkably for a medieval figure this legendary, reasonably well documented. Rodrigo Diaz was born around 1043 in Vivar, near Burgos, and rose to prominence as a military commander, serving at various points in his complicated career, both Christian Castilian and Muslim Taifa rulers during the fractured political landscape of 11th century Iberia, a period when alliances between Christian and Muslim states were considerably more fluid and pragmatic than later romanticized retellings would suggest. His most significant achievement came in 1094, when he conquered the Taifa of Valencia and ruled it independently until his death in 1099, an extraordinary feat for a nobleman operating largely outside formal royal authority for much of his career. He was buried initially at the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña, just outside Burgos, alongside his wife, Jimena, following her own death several years later. This is where the historical record, reasonably solid up to this point, begins its long, complicated relationship with disruption. The first documented disturbance came relatively early. Medieval and early modern accounts describe multiple instances of the tomb being opened, moved, or restored within the monastery itself over subsequent centuries, a pattern not unusual for the burial sites of prominent medieval figures, whose remains were sometimes relocated to more prestigious positions within a church as their posthumous reputation grew, or disturbed during building renovations, or in some documented cases across medieval Europe generally, quietly stripped of any valuable grave goods long before anyone thought to carefully record the process. The more dramatic disruption came centuries later, during the Peninsular War in the early 19th century, when Napoleonic forces occupying Spain caused extensive damage to numerous religious sites, including San Pedro de Cardeña. Historical accounts from this period describe El Cid's tomb being disturbed amid the general chaos and destruction visited on the monastery, with some contemporary and near-contemporary sources suggesting French soldiers specifically targeted or desecrated the grave, whether from simple vandalism, a search for valuables, or a more pointed act aimed at a symbol of Spanish national identity and resistance, a status El Cid had held in Spanish cultural memory for centuries by that point. The precise details of what happened to the remains during this specific period of upheaval are recorded with considerably less consistency than the broader historical events surrounding them. Various accounts differ on exactly how the bones were handled, whether they were briefly scattered, deliberately hidden by monks attempting to protect them, or removed and stored elsewhere for safekeeping during the ongoing military occupation. What is documented with more confidence is that remains identified as El Cid's and Jimena's were eventually recovered or reassembled following the war's end, and remained at the monastery for several more decades before a final, formal relocation, ordered by Spanish authorities in 1921, transferred them to Burgos Cathedral, where they were interred with considerable ceremony at the crossing of the nave, before their final move to the current crypt location during a subsequent cathedral renovation. This is where a historian attempting to trace a fully unbroken chain of custody from 1099 to the present runs into a genuine, if narrow, problem. Between the original 11th century burial and the final 1921 transfer, the remains identified as El Cid's passed through at least one, and by some accounts several, periods of disturbance, temporary relocation, and incomplete documentation, particularly during the chaotic Napoleonic-era disruption, during which the specific continuous physical custody of the remains is not as cleanly documented as historians studying the matter would generally prefer. No modern forensic or genetic testing has been conducted to verify the remains in Burgos Cathedral against any confirmed biological reference, an approach that has helped resolve identity questions surrounding other historical remains in recent decades, largely because the necessary comparative material and, more fundamentally, the ecclesiastical and cultural sensitivities involved in disturbing a national symbol's resting place a second time in the modern era have made such testing something Spanish authorities have not pursued. This doesn't mean serious historians broadly doubt the remains are genuinely El Cid's. The documented chain, while imperfect at certain specific junctures, particularly the war years, is considerably stronger than the provenance surrounding many medieval relics and remains discussed elsewhere in this exploration, and no credible alternative burial site or competing claim to his remains has ever seriously emerged. But the specific granular uncertainty around exactly what happened during the disruption of the Peninsular War, whether the remains that emerged from that chaotic period were handled with full, careful continuity, or whether some degree of loss, mixing, or incomplete recovery occurred amid the destruction, however small, has never been fully resolved, and given the current absence of any modern verification testing, likely won't be definitively closed anytime soon. A smaller, more speculative thread of inquiry, circulating primarily among regional historians rather than mainstream academic research, has focused on San Pedro de Cardeña itself, asking whether any portion of the original burial site, undisturbed grave goods, additional remains, or artifacts associated with the original 11th century interment that may not have been fully recovered or accounted for during the various relocations, might still exist somewhere within or beneath the monastery grounds, effectively separated from the primary remains that eventually made their long journey to Burgos Cathedral. This remains unconfirmed, and no significant archaeological investigation specifically targeting this question has been conducted at the monastery in recent years. What lies beneath that marble slab in Burgos today is, in all likelihood, genuinely Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, resting in a cathedral built long after his death, having traveled there through a path considerably more disrupted than the simple, dignified transfer most visitors likely assume. Whether every fragment of that path could withstand the kind of rigorous forensic scrutiny now available to modern historians, and whether Spain's most legendary medieval warrior will ever actually be asked to undergo it, remains, for now, a question the cathedral crypt keeps quietly to itself. In 1952, in a cave near the ruins of Qumran, on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, archaeologists uncovered something unlike anything else found among the hundreds of Dead Sea Scroll fragments recovered from the surrounding caves over the preceding years. Where the other scrolls were written on parchment or papyrus, carrying religious texts, biblical manuscripts, and sectarian community writings, this one was engraved on sheets of nearly pure copper, riveted together into a single scroll roughly 2.5 meters long, so badly oxidized and brittle after 2,000 years that it couldn't be safely unrolled. It had to be cut into strips at a laboratory in Manchester in 1956 before anyone could finally read what it said. What it said was a list. 64 locations described in terse, almost telegraphic Hebrew, each one specifying a quantity of buried treasure, gold, silver, and in a few entries, aromatic oils and other valuable goods, along with directional and landmark-based descriptions meant to guide someone back to the hiding place. The combined value of the treasure described, tallied using the ancient units of measurement recorded in the text, comes to a genuinely staggering figure, one that, converted into modern terms using standard estimates of ancient talent and mina weights, would represent an enormous fortune, in some scholarly estimates equivalent to many tons of precious metal. This is where the copper scroll immediately distinguishes itself from every other Dead Sea Scroll found at Qumran. The other manuscripts are overwhelmingly religious and literary in character. Biblical texts, community rules, apocalyptic writings, and sectarian commentary, consistent with most scholars' understanding of Qumran as home to a Jewish religious community, commonly associated with the Essenes, though this identification remains debated among specialists, active roughly between the 2nd century BC and the site's destruction during the Jewish revolt against Rome in the late 1st century AD. The Copper Scroll fits none of that pattern. It contains no religious content, no names, no dates, no explanation of context. It reads as a purely practical, administrative document, a treasure inventory, and nothing else. The central question scholars have debated since 1956 is deceptively simple to ask and remarkably difficult to answer. Was the treasure real? The mainstream position among most scholars who've studied the text is that the treasure it describes probably was genuine, though considerable debate remains over its precise origin. The leading theory connects the treasure to the Jerusalem temple, proposing that the items listed represent temple treasures, funds, and consecrated objects hidden by priests or temple officials sometime before or during the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Hidden with the explicit intention of protecting sacred wealth from Roman confiscation, and presumably recorded on a durable, non-perishable material, specifically because copper, unlike papyrus or parchment, could survive burial and exposure over an extended, uncertain period until someone returned to reclaim what had been hidden. This theory fits both the scale of wealth described, plausible for an institution as significant as the Second Temple, and the practical logic of engraving the list on metal rather than more perishable materials. If this theory is correct, and a considerable number of scholars find it persuasive, then the copper scroll represents something genuinely remarkable. An authentic treasure map to some portion of the wealth of one of the ancient world's most significant religious institutions. Wealth that, so far as any confirmed archaeological or historical record indicates, has never been recovered. But this theory doesn't fully resolve the matter, and several persistent difficulties have kept the debate active for close to 7 decades. The locations described in the scroll are maddeningly imprecise by modern standards, referencing landmarks, structures, and geographic features using terminology that in some cases can't be confidently matched to any known ancient site, whether because the landmarks themselves no longer exist, having been destroyed or altered over 2,000 years of subsequent construction and destruction across the region, or because the original terminology has genuine linguistic ambiguities that modern scholars, despite considerable effort, haven't been able to fully resolve. Several expeditions across the decades since the scroll's translation have attempted to locate specific sites it describes, along the routes and near the landmarks the text identifies, and none have produced a confirmed recovery of the treasure as described. This persistent failure to locate any of the 64 caches has fueled a competing scholarly position, one that doesn't necessarily dismiss the scroll as pure fantasy, but questions whether the amounts recorded were accurately transcribed, or whether the entire document may represent something closer to folklore or legend, a written record of treasure traditions and stories that had already taken on an exaggerated, semi-legendary character by the time they were formally inscribed onto copper, rather than a precise, literal accounting produced by someone with direct, contemporary knowledge of the treasure's actual location and value. Under this reading, the scroll may still preserve a genuine kernel of historical memory, quite possibly connected to real temple wealth hidden during a period of real crisis, without every specific quantity and location necessarily representing verified fact rather than embellished tradition. A smaller number of researchers have proposed more specific theories about particular caches described in the text, occasionally connecting individual entries to documented historical events or locations with reasonable specificity, proposals that remain individually debated rather than broadly confirmed. And the underlying practical challenge that has frustrated every serious search effort remains largely unchanged since 1956. The topography and infrastructure of the region have been transformed repeatedly over 2 millennia by subsequent settlement, agriculture, and construction, meaning even a search conducted with genuine textual precision faces landmarks that may simply no longer exist in recognizable form. The copper scroll itself is preserved today, its cut strips stabilized and reassembled for research purposes. 17 columns of terse Hebrew instruction to a treasure that, so far as the historical and archaeological record confirms, no one has ever definitively recovered. Whether that absence reflects treasure still waiting, precisely where an anonymous scribe once recorded it 2,000 years ago, treasure recovered by someone else long before modern archaeology arrived to look, or a written tradition whose scale was always more legend than ledger, remains a question the copper itself, silent and sealed since it was first engraved, has never been able to answer on its own. On the northeastern coast of Oman, where the Gulf of Oman meets a shoreline of jagged cliffs and sudden inlets, the ruins of Qalhat sit largely reclaimed by wind and salt, its most recognizable surviving structure a domed mausoleum, believed to house the remains of a 13th century queen, standing largely alone now above a landscape of low walls and building foundations that once supported one of the most important trading cities in the medieval Indian Ocean world. Qalhat's later history is documented with genuine confidence, thanks in considerable part to two of the most famous travelers of the medieval world passing directly through it. Marco Polo, in the late 13th century, described Qalhat as a noble and prosperous city, an important stop for ships trading horses, dates, and other goods between Arabia and India. Ibn Battuta, visiting several decades later in the 14th century, offered similarly detailed praise, describing its markets, its striking congregational mosque, and its position as a major port under the authority of the Kingdom of Hormuz, the powerful trading polity that controlled much of the Strait of Hormuz, and, through it, a considerable share of Indian Ocean commerce during this period. Both accounts describe a city already fully established, wealthy, and cosmopolitan, comfortably participating in exactly the kind of long-distance maritime trade network that connected Rhapta's East African coastline centuries earlier, all the way to the ports of India and beyond. This later prosperity, and Qalhat's eventual well-documented destruction, an earthquake in the early 16th century, compounded by Portuguese naval attacks during the same general period as European powers began aggressively contesting Indian Ocean trade routes, are reasonably settled matters within the historical record. What remains considerably murkier, and what recent archaeological work has only begun to seriously address, is the earlier question: how, and exactly when, did Qalhat first grow from whatever smaller settlement may have originally occupied this stretch of coastline into the major trading metropolis Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta would later encounter already fully formed? Archaeological investigation at Qalhat has intensified significantly since the site's inscription as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2018, with French and Omani excavation teams conducting systematic work aimed specifically at reconstructing the site's fuller occupation history, rather than relying primarily on the medieval travelers' accounts that had long dominated understanding of the city. This more recent excavation work has confirmed occupation at Qalhat considerably earlier than the 13th century prosperity described by Marco Polo, with evidence suggesting the site functioned as a settlement of some kind, reaching back several additional centuries earlier, though the scale, organization, and specific economic character of this earlier settlement remain considerably less well understood than the city's later, thoroughly documented Golden Age. This creates a genuine gap in the narrative, one that sits at the center of Qalhat's less publicized mystery. Coastal Omani trade along this general stretch of coastline has ancient roots, with the broader region's participation in Indian Ocean maritime commerce documented in various forms across a span of well over 1,000 years before Qalhat's medieval peak. But the specific mechanism behind Qalhat's own transformation from an earlier, more modest coastal settlement into the major Hormuz-affiliated metropolis described in the 13th and 14th centuries remains only partially reconstructed. Was there a specific identifiable trigger, a change in regional trade routes, a deliberate investment by an early Hormuz ruler recognizing the site's strategic value, or a gradual accumulation of maritime trade advantage building steadily over generations? That explains why this particular stretch of coastline, rather than any number of comparable inlets along the same general shoreline, became the dominant regional port. The site's relationship with the Kingdom of Hormuz adds a further layer of complexity worth sitting with. Hormuz itself, the polity under whose authority Qalhat operated during its documented peak, has its own genuinely debated early history, with historians divided over the precise timeline and circumstances of Hormuz's rise to regional dominance over strait trade. If Qalhat's own expansion was closely tied to Hormuz's broader political and commercial rise, a connection most historians consider likely given the extensive documented affiliation during the city's peak, then uncertainty in one polity's early history compounds uncertainty in the other, making it genuinely difficult to separate Qalhat's own specific developmental timeline from the broader, similarly incompletely documented story of Hormuz's regional ascent. Ongoing excavation has identified architectural phases at the site that suggest significant building activity considerably predating the structures visible in their final, best-preserved form, the mausoleum most prominent among them, indicating the city underwent multiple phases of construction and expansion across its history, rather than emerging in anything resembling a single building campaign. But connecting these earlier architectural phases to specific historical events, specific rulers, or specific economic developments remains difficult, precisely because the earlier layers of the site have historically received far less excavation attention than the better-preserved later structures, and because Qalhat, unlike some of the sites already explored in this series, left behind comparatively little in the way of local inscriptional or administrative record documenting its own internal history in its own words, leaving historians dependent primarily on external accounts, like Marco Polo's and Ibn Battuta's, that arrive already well into the city's established prosperity, offering little direct insight into how that prosperity was actually built. Some researchers examining the broader pattern of Indian Ocean port cities during this era have proposed that Qalhat's early expansion may have been closely tied to its specific role supplying and provisioning horses for export to Indian markets, a trade explicitly mentioned in Marco Polo's account and documented as economically significant across multiple Gulf ports during this period, potentially representing an earlier, specialized economic niche that predated and eventually helped fund the city's later, more diversified prosperity as a broader Indian Ocean trading hub. This remains a plausible but not yet fully confirmed explanation, one that ongoing excavation work may eventually be positioned to test more directly as earlier occupation layers receive further study. What stands at Qalhat today is a city whose dramatic final chapters, prosperity, earthquake, and eventual abandonment, are documented with unusual clarity by the standards of medieval history. Its earliest chapters, the specific process by which a stretch of Omani coastline first became worth building a city upon at all, remain considerably less resolved, buried beneath the same later structures that made the city famous enough for travelers to bother describing it in the first place. In the Kremlin Armory in Moscow, behind reinforced glass, sits a cap of gold filigree, trimmed with sable and topped with a cross, known as the Cap of Monomach. For centuries it served as the ceremonial crown of Muscovite rulers, used in coronation ceremonies from the late medieval period well into the early modern era. Tradition once held that it had belonged to the 11th century Kievan Rus ruler Vladimir Monomach, supposedly gifted to him by the Byzantine emperor himself, a direct physical link between the golden age of Kievan Rus and the later Muscovite state that claimed to be its successor. Modern art historical and metallurgical analysis has firmly dated the cap itself to a considerably later period, most likely Central Asian craftsmanship from the 13th or 14th century, meaning the physical object in the armory almost certainly has nothing to do with Vladimir Monomach at all. And this single, carefully documented case of manufactured continuity sits at the entrance to a much larger, much less resolved question. What happened to the actual regalia, crowns, ceremonial objects, and symbols of authority used by the earliest rulers of Kievan Rus, the founding state from which Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus all trace significant elements of their shared early medieval origin? Kievan Rus emerged as a recognizable political entity by the late 9th century, with Kiev established as its principal seat of power under a ruling dynasty later known as the Rurikids, named for the semi-legendary Varangian leader Rurik, whose own historicity and precise role remain debated among historians, though the broader Rurikid dynasty that claimed descent from him ruled Rus territories continuously for over 7 centuries. The state reached a particular height under rulers like Vladimir the Great, who formally adopted Orthodox Christianity for Rus around 988 AD, and later his son Yaroslav the Wise, whose reign in the 11th century is generally considered the cultural and political peak of the Kievan period, marked by extensive building projects, legal codification, and dynastic marriages connecting Kiev to royal houses across Europe and Byzantium. A state of this scale and sophistication, one maintaining diplomatic relationships with Byzantium, the Holy Roman Empire, and various European kingdoms, would be expected, by the standards of comparable medieval monarchies, to have possessed a genuine material culture of rulership. Crowns or diadems, ceremonial staffs or scepters, ornamented thrones, robes of state, and other physical symbols used to visually establish and reinforce royal authority during coronations, diplomatic receptions, and religious ceremonies. Byzantine sources, and later Rus chronicles themselves, occasionally reference such objects in passing, mentions of princely regalia, ceremonial dress, and symbolic objects associated with specific rulers. What has never been recovered in any confirmed archaeological find is a substantial, confidently attributed body of actual royal regalia dating to the earliest, formative centuries of Kievan Rus rule, roughly the late 9th through 11th centuries. This absence is not, on its own, entirely mysterious. Medieval royal regalia across many cultures, not merely Rus territory, has a documented tendency to disappear, melted down for its precious metal content during later financial crises, lost during conquest and looting, or simply worn out and replaced by successor rulers who saw little value in preserving objects specifically associated with a predecessor's reign rather than their own. But Kievan Rus's specific historical trajectory adds a particular intensity to this general pattern of loss, because the state's political center, and with it, presumably, whatever accumulated royal treasury and regalia had built up across its early centuries, was subjected to a catastrophic, well-documented destruction event. The Mongol invasion and sack of Kiev in 1240 under the command of Batu Khan, an event contemporary and near-contemporary chronicles describe in devastating terms, with the city's population massacred or scattered and its major structures, including its most significant churches, extensively damaged or destroyed. If any substantial collection of early Rus royal regalia survived intact up until 1240, the Mongol sack represents the most obvious historically documented point at which it could have been permanently lost, whether carried off as plunder into the broader Mongol world, destroyed during the city's burning, or scattered and subsequently lost to history during the chaotic collapse of centralized authority that followed across Rus territories in the invasion's aftermath. This explanation is straightforward, well supported by the broader historical record of the invasion's severity, and accounts for why so little survives from before this date compared to the somewhat richer material record available from later Rus principalities that emerged, and in some cases prospered, in the invasion's long aftermath. But this explanation, while broadly satisfying as far as it goes, doesn't fully resolve several more specific puzzles that continue to occupy historians and archaeologists working on the early Rus period. The first involves the question of what, precisely, early Rus royal regalia actually looked like, and how it may have differed across the roughly 3.5 centuries separating Rurik's semi-legendary establishment of the dynasty and the Mongol invasion. Rus rulers during this period operated within a cultural sphere heavily influenced by, but distinct from, Byzantine imperial tradition, following Vladimir's adoption of Orthodox Christianity, while also maintaining earlier Scandinavian and broader Northern European cultural connections inherited from the dynasty's Varangian origins. Did early Rus regalia more closely resemble Byzantine imperial models, elaborate court dress, jeweled diadems following Constantinople's example, or did it retain distinct elements reflecting the dynasty's Norse origins, weapons, torques, or other symbolic objects more consistent with broader Scandinavian and Baltic elite material culture of the same era? Surviving artistic depictions from the period, primarily religious frescoes and a small number of illuminated manuscripts, offer only limited stylized glimpses of ruling figures, typically rendered in formal religious postures that prioritize theological symbolism over accurate documentation of specific regalia, leaving historians working from frustratingly thin visual evidence when attempting to reconstruct what these objects genuinely looked like. The second and considerably more specific puzzle involves a small number of individual objects with genuine, if incomplete, documentary trails connecting them to the early Rus period, objects whose current whereabouts or even continued existence remain unconfirmed. Historical and later chronicle references mention specific ceremonial items associated with particular rulers. Yaroslav the Wise's reign in particular generates several such references, given the relative wealth of documentation surviving from his era compared to earlier rulers. Items whose descriptions don't clearly correspond to anything currently held in any confirmed museum or church treasury collection today. Some historians have proposed that a portion of this material may have survived the initial Mongol sack of Kiev, only to be lost or dispersed during the subsequent centuries of Mongol overlordship across Rus territories, a period during which regional princes were required to travel to the Golden Horde's capital to receive formal confirmation of their rule. Journeys during which valuable regalia, gifts, and tribute moved across considerable distances under circumstances not always fully documented in surviving records. A further complication involves the fate of Kiev's churches specifically, since medieval regalia and treasury items were frequently stored within, or closely associated with, major religious institutions rather than purely secular royal residences, a common pattern across medieval Christian Europe generally. The Church of the Tithes, Kiev's first major stone church, commissioned by Vladimir the Great himself in the late 10th century, was reportedly destroyed during the 1240 Mongol assault, with later accounts describing it collapsing under the weight of refugees who had taken shelter within it as the city fell, though the precise circumstances and extent of the building's destruction, and what, if anything, of its treasury survived, remain incompletely documented even by the standards of an already poorly documented catastrophic event. If early regalia, or elements of it, were stored within Kiev's major churches at the time of the invasion, their fate would be directly tied to buildings whose own destruction is confirmed, but whose specific treasury losses were never, so far as surviving records indicate, fully inventoried either before or after the event. This combination of circumstances, a documented catastrophic destruction event, genuinely limited surviving visual and textual evidence for what the objects in question actually looked like, and a small number of tantalizing but unresolved chronicle references to specific items whose current status remains unknown, has kept the question of early Rus royal regalia as a subject of ongoing, if relatively specialized, academic interest, alongside a smaller body of more speculative proposals circulating outside strictly mainstream archaeological research. Some of these more speculative threads have focused on the possibility that portions of early Rus treasury material may have been deliberately hidden or evacuated from Kiev in the period immediately preceding the Mongol assault, given that Rus principalities had received considerable advance warning of the Mongol advance through its earlier campaigns against neighboring territories, raising the question of whether some rulers or church officials, anticipating the city's fall, may have attempted to remove or conceal particularly valuable or symbolically significant items before the invasion reached Kiev itself. No confirmed archaeological discovery has yet substantiated this possibility for royal regalia specifically, though hoards of coins and other valuables dating to this general period, presumably buried for safekeeping during the invasion and never recovered by their original owners, have been discovered in various locations across the broader region, confirming that this general pattern of pre-invasion concealment genuinely occurred for at least some forms of medieval wealth, even if no confirmed regalia-specific find has yet emerged to match it. What survives today, in Moscow's Kremlin armory and in various other collections across the region claiming connections to the early Rus period, is a body of material whose relationship to the actual court culture of 9th through 11th century Kiev ranges from the confidently documented to the highly doubtful, the cap of Monomach's exposed later provenance serving as perhaps the clearest cautionary example of how easily later political needs, in that particular case, Muscovy's own desire to claim direct symbolic descent from Kievan Rus's golden age, could produce objects presented as ancient regalia that modern analysis eventually revealed to be something considerably different. The actual crowns, staffs, and ceremonial objects that once marked the authority of Rurik's earliest successors, the physical symbols Vladimir the Great and Yaroslav the Wise would have worn or carried during the ceremonies and diplomatic receptions chronicled, however briefly, in surviving Rus and Byzantine sources, remain, so far as current archaeological and historical evidence can confirm, genuinely lost, whether destroyed in Kiev's burning churches in 1240, scattered piece by piece across the subsequent 2 centuries of Mongol overlordship. Or perhaps, still sitting somewhere beneath ground that has never been specifically excavated with this particular question in mind, waiting, like so many of the objects and institutions already traced through this exploration, for the right combination of documentary insight and careful fieldwork to finally bring them back into the light. High above the choir of Winchester Cathedral, resting atop the stone screens that flank the presbytery, sit 6 carved wooden chests, painted and gilded, each one inscribed with the names of Anglo-Saxon kings, queens, and bishops. They have sat in roughly this position, in one form or another, for centuries, and for most of that time, visitors and clergy alike simply accepted what the inscriptions claimed: that these were the mortuary chests of some of England's earliest and most significant rulers, monarchs like Cynegoles, Egbert, and Canute, gathered together in a single cathedral as a kind of consolidated royal memorial. What nobody could confirm for a very long time was whether the bones inside actually belonged to the people the chests claimed to hold, or whether centuries of disruption had left Winchester Cathedral in possession of a genuinely extraordinary collection of early English royal remains that had, at some point, become hopelessly and perhaps irreversibly scrambled. Winchester's status as a major royal and ecclesiastical center stretches back to the early Anglo-Saxon period, when it served as the capital of the Kingdom of Wessex, and later, following Wessex's expansion under rulers like Alfred the Great and his successors, as one of the most important cities in a unified England. Old Minster, the cathedral's Anglo-Saxon predecessor, built on an adjacent site beginning in the 7th century and expanded significantly over subsequent centuries, became the burial place of choice for a considerable number of Wessex, and later, broader English royalty, along with senior bishops who served the diocese. This wasn't an informal or accidental accumulation. Winchester's role as a royal mausoleum was a deliberate, sustained pattern spanning several centuries, comparable in its own way to Westminster Abbey's later, better documented role as the resting place of English monarchs. The current Winchester Cathedral, the Norman and later medieval structure most visitors encounter today, was built adjacent to and eventually replacing Old Minster, beginning in 1079, under Bishop Walchelin, following the Norman conquest. As construction progressed, the remains of the various kings, queens, and bishops previously interred at Old Minster were transferred to the new cathedral, a translation of remains that occurred, by most accounts, with genuine ceremony and care, at least initially, reflecting the significance still attached to these particular royal burials, even under new Norman ecclesiastical authority. This is where the historical record begins to thin considerably, and where the specific mystery this chapter explores actually takes root. The mortuary chests visible today at Winchester weren't created during this initial Norman-era translation of remains. They date instead to the 1520s, commissioned under Bishop Richard Fox, roughly 4.5 centuries after the original transfer from Old Minster, and representing, by that point, at least the second, and quite possibly not the final, physical relocation these particular remains had undergone since their original Anglo-Saxon interments. Between the 11th century translation and the 16th century chest commissioning, the remains appear to have been kept, based on limited surviving documentation, in a less formally organized state, and the precise continuity of record-keeping across this roughly 400-year gap is where confidence in the chest's contents begins to erode. When Bishop Fox commissioned the current chests, inscribing each with specific royal and episcopal names, the process of actually sorting which bones belonged to which named individual relied on whatever documentation, tradition, and physical evidence was available to 16th century clergy, working with skeletal remains that had, by that point, potentially been through multiple handling and storage transitions since their original burials, with no method available to that era for confirming individual identity beyond documentary tradition, and, presumably, whatever markings or contextual information had survived alongside the bones themselves. The situation deteriorated further, and considerably more violently, during the English Civil War in the 1640s. Parliamentarian soldiers, hostile to what they viewed as idolatrous religious imagery and royal symbolism, reportedly broke open the mortuary chests during their occupation of the cathedral, scattering the bones across the cathedral floor, according to contemporary and near-contemporary accounts of the incident. The remains were subsequently gathered up and returned to the chests, but critically, this recovery effort occurred under chaotic circumstances, with no reliable method available to ensure that bones were returned to the specific chest or associated with the specific named individual they had originally been sorted with prior to the disturbance. Whatever confidence in individual identification the 1520 sorting process might have carried was, by most historians' assessment, significantly, perhaps fatally, compromised by this single 17th century event. This left Winchester Cathedral, for the following 3.5 centuries, in possession of 6 chests containing a substantial quantity of genuinely ancient, genuinely significant royal and episcopal remains, inscribed with specific royal names carrying centuries of tradition behind them, but with a documented, acknowledged gap in the chain of custody, serious enough that no historian could confidently state which specific bones belonged to which specific named king. Modern science has, in relatively recent years, begun to seriously address this uncertainty. Beginning in 2012, a research team led by Winchester Cathedral in partnership with academic osteologists undertook a comprehensive study of the mortuary chest's contents, combining detailed osteological analysis, radiocarbon dating, and, where possible, comparison against historical and genealogical records, in an effort to establish, as precisely as the available material would allow, which remains could be confidently dated and sexed in ways consistent or inconsistent with the specific individuals named on each chest. The findings, released across subsequent research publications through the following decade, confirmed some of historians' long-standing suspicions while also producing some genuinely significant new information. The bones within the chests were conclusively confirmed, through radiocarbon dating, to span the correct general historical period, consistent with genuine Anglo-Saxon and early Norman-era royal and episcopal burials, rather than later intrusions or unrelated remains. This alone confirmed the chests do contain authentically ancient material of the right general age and status. But the research also confirmed, in considerable additional detail, that the bones within individual chests were often mixed, representing multiple different individuals commingled together within a single container, rather than each chest containing the remains of one specific, cleanly separated individual matching its inscription. Perhaps the most striking specific finding involved the discovery of bones belonging to at least one, and by some analysis possibly 2, medieval women mixed among the remains, despite the chest's inscriptions listing exclusively male kings and bishops. This detail has generated genuine, ongoing scholarly speculation, since no clear documentary record explains why female remains would have become mixed into a collection specifically curated, at least according to its inscriptions, to hold only male royal and ecclesiastical figures. Some researchers have proposed these might represent Wessex queens, whose burials were included in the original Old Minster royal mausoleum tradition, but whose specific identity and inclusion were lost or deliberately omitted from the chest inscriptions during the 1520 sorting and labeling process, perhaps reflecting the specific commemorative priorities of Bishop Fox's era rather than a complete accounting of everyone actually present in the original burial tradition. This remains a proposed explanation rather than a confirmed one, since no specific documentary evidence has yet emerged clearly identifying which queen, or queens, these remains might represent. The research has also allowed scholars to attempt a more targeted identification for at least a few specific, more securely attested individuals, using a combination of radiocarbon dating consistent with known death dates, and, in select cases, distinctive skeletal features potentially consistent with documented historical descriptions or circumstances. Some findings have lent partial support to specific chest inscriptions, remains consistent with the correct general period and status for a particular named king, for instance, while others have raised specific doubts, remains within a chest inscribed for one individual, instead producing radiocarbon dates or skeletal characteristics more consistent with a different historical period or individual entirely, findings that complicate, rather than confirm the 16th century labeling scheme. What remains, even after this considerably more sophisticated modern analysis, is a body of genuinely ancient, genuinely significant royal remains whose precise individual identities, king by king, bishop by bishop, cannot be fully and confidently reconstructed, not through any fault of modern science, but because the chain of physical custody connecting these bones to their original Anglo-Saxon burials was compromised at multiple points across the intervening 1,000 years, most severely during a single chaotic afternoon of 17th century iconoclasm, from which the remains never fully recovered a clean, verifiable identity. Cyngals, Egbert, Canute, and the other names inscribed on Winchester's chests represent real historical figures genuinely buried at this site across the Anglo-Saxon and early Norman periods. Whether the specific bones resting beneath each specific inscription today truly belong to the king or bishop that inscription names, or whether centuries of translation, storage, and violent disruption have left England's early royal remains permanently and untraceably intermingled, sorted now only by best available scientific estimate rather than certain historical record, is a question modern research has narrowed considerably, without fully closing. 6 chests still rest above Winchester's choir, holding what is, without serious dispute, the physical remains of some of the earliest and most significant figures in English royal and religious history. Exactly whose remains rest in exactly which chest is a question that, after 1,000 years, a civil war, and a decade of careful modern forensic study, still cannot be answered with complete, individual certainty. In the old quarter of Marrakesh, beneath streets that have been continuously inhabited for nearly 1,000 years, lie the foundations of buildings that once belonged to one of the most consequential empires medieval North and West Africa ever produced. An empire whose military and religious reach stretched from the Sahara's edge to the heart of Iberia, and whose written administrative legacy, remarkably, is almost entirely gone. The Almoravids emerged in the 11th century from a religious and military movement rooted among the Sanhaja Berber tribes of the Western Sahara. Unified initially under the reformist teaching of the scholar Abdallah ibn Yassin, before consolidating into a genuine imperial power under successive rulers, most notably Yusuf ibn Tashfin, who founded Marrakesh as the empire's capital around 1070, and who, in 1086, led Almoravid forces across the Strait of Gibraltar to decisively defeat the Christian kingdom of Castile at the Battle of Sagrajas, an intervention that significantly extended Muslim rule in Iberia for generations and reshaped the political landscape of the entire peninsula. At its height, the Almoravid Empire controlled a territory spanning from the West African Sahel, through the whole of Morocco, and across much of Muslim Iberia, administering an enormously diverse population and an economy built substantially on trans-Saharan gold trade routes connecting West African goldfields to Mediterranean and European markets. An empire operating at this scale, governing this much territory, coordinating military campaigns across the Strait of Gibraltar, and managing the kind of long-distance trade infrastructure that made Almoravid gold coinage a trusted, widely circulated currency across the medieval Mediterranean world, would have required, by any reasonable comparative standard, a substantial administrative apparatus, tax records, military logistics, diplomatic correspondence, judicial rulings, land grants, and the countless other categories of documentation that empires of comparable scale, the Fatimids, the Ghaznavids, contemporary Iberian Christian kingdoms, all generated and, to varying degrees, preserved. And yet the Almoravid Empire's own administrative archive, the direct paper trail of how this remarkable state actually governed itself day to day, survives today in only the barest fragments, a gap considerably more severe than the comparative documentation available for several other medieval Islamic states of similar or even lesser regional significance. This absence is not, on its surface, entirely without explanation, and the mainstream historical account for it centers on the empire's own violent and relatively rapid downfall. The Almoravid state, having reached its territorial peak in the early 12th century, faced increasingly serious internal religious and political challenges from a rival reform movement, the Almohads, originating, much as the Almoravids themselves once had, from a religiously motivated Berber movement in the Atlas Mountains, this one under the leadership of Ibn Tumart, and later his successor, Abd al-Mu'min. The Almohad conquest of Almoravid territory proceeded in stages across the 1120s through the 1140s, culminating in the fall of Marrakesh itself in 1147, an event contemporary and near-contemporary chronicles describe as involving considerable violence and destruction, with the ruling Almoravid dynasty largely eliminated and their capital brought under direct Almohad control. Regime change of this violence and totality, a rival dynasty explicitly defining itself in religious opposition to its predecessor rather than as a continuation of it, has historically been associated, across numerous documented cases in medieval Islamic and broader world history, with the deliberate or incidental destruction of the previous regime's administrative and symbolic infrastructure, libraries, treasuries, and government archives among the most vulnerable categories of material in exactly this kind of transition, since a conquering power with a strong ideological stake in delegitimizing its predecessor often has limited institutional interest in carefully preserving that predecessor's bureaucratic paper trail, whatever practical administrative value such records might theoretically have offered the new regime. Some historical accounts of the Almohad conquest of Marrakesh do describe considerable destruction accompanying the city's fall, though, as with several other similarly documented medieval conquests already discussed in this exploration, the specific itemized fate of the Almoravid government's actual administrative archive, as opposed to the broader physical destruction of the city and its ruling dynasty, is not something surviving chronicles address with the kind of granular detail a modern historian would prefer. This straightforward destruction narrative, however, doesn't fully satisfy several scholars who've studied the specific pattern of Almoravid documentary survival, because the absence isn't limited neatly to administrative records lost specifically at Marrakesh in 1147. It extends more broadly across nearly the entire Almoravid documentary record, including categories of material that, given the empire's territorial reach, should reasonably have existed and potentially survived in multiple, geographically dispersed locations beyond the capital alone, Almoravid Iberia in particular, where the empire governed extensive territory for over half a century, interacting continuously with a Christian Iberian administrative culture that, on the Christian side of that same frontier, has left behind a considerably richer surviving documentary record from the same general period. Why would Almoravid administrative material specifically tied to Iberian governance, material that wouldn't necessarily have been physically concentrated at Marrakesh and vulnerable to that single conquest event, also survive in such strikingly limited quantities? Part of the explanation likely lies in the broader pattern of medieval Islamic archival practice and material survival across the region generally. Since administrative documents produced on parchment or paper in medieval North Africa and Iberia faced considerable risk of loss simply through the ordinary attrition of time, climate, and repeated subsequent regime changes across a region that, in the centuries following the Almoravid collapse, continued experiencing significant political instability, the Almohad Empire's own eventual fragmentation and collapse in the 13th century, representing just one additional layer of disruption stacked atop the earlier Almoravid-Almohad transition. Each subsequent upheaval representing another opportunity for whatever earlier administrative material had managed to survive the previous transition to be lost, destroyed, or simply neglected into eventual decay. But this general pattern of gradual attrition, while genuinely applicable across much of the region's medieval documentary history, still doesn't fully explain why Almoravid material specifically appears to have fared notably worse than either the earlier Umayyad and Taifa-era Iberian administrative traditions the Almoravids themselves partially inherited, or the later Almohad and subsequent Marinid administrative records from successor states governing broadly the same territory, both of which, while still incompletely preserved by modern archival standards, offer historians a meaningfully richer documentary foundation than what survives from the Almoravid period specifically sitting between them. This comparative gap has led some historians to propose more specific, if still largely unconfirmed, explanations. One line of inquiry has focused on the Almoravid dynasty's own particular religious and administrative character, noting that the movement's origins in a relatively austere, reform-minded religious tradition, and its administrative structure, which some scholars characterize as having remained comparatively less bureaucratically elaborate than some contemporary states despite the empire's considerable territorial scale, possibly reflecting the movement's original tribal and religious rather than purely administrative foundations, may mean the underlying volume of formal written record. The state itself originally produced was, from the outset, genuinely smaller relative to its territorial size than comparably sized contemporary states, a structural characteristic of the regime itself rather than purely a matter of later material loss. This remains a debated interpretation rather than a settled conclusion, and some historians have pushed back against characterizing Almoravid administration as underdeveloped, pointing to the empire's clear logistical sophistication in coordinating military campaigns and trans-Saharan trade as evidence of administrative capacity that should, in principle, have generated a more substantial documentary record than what has survived. A smaller, more speculative thread of inquiry has focused on the specific possibility that portions of the Almoravid archive, rather than being destroyed outright during the Almohad conquest, may have been deliberately dispersed, or in some cases actively suppressed and hidden by Almohad authorities. Specifically because certain categories of Almoravid administrative and religious documentation, tax rulings, legal opinions, and correspondence reflecting the specific theological positions the Almoravids had held, positions the Almohad movement explicitly defined itself against, represented material the new regime had active ideological motivation to see disappear rather than simply neglected material lost through ordinary post-conquest disorder. Under this reading, the unusually thorough absence of Almoravid documentary material wouldn't primarily reflect passive loss through time and regional instability, but a more deliberate, if now largely undocumented process of archival erasure carried out in the specific service of establishing Almohad religious and political legitimacy over a predecessor regime the new rulers had every institutional interest in discrediting as thoroughly as possible. This theory remains difficult to confirm through direct evidence, precisely because a genuinely successful campaign of documentary suppression would, by its own logic, leave correspondingly little trace of itself either. What survives from the Almoravid Empire today exists primarily through indirect and external sources. Chronicles written by later historians working from now lost earlier material, the empire's distinctive gold coinage, still recovered in archaeological contexts across a wide geographic range reflecting the trade networks it once anchored. Architectural remains, including elements of Marrakesh's original urban foundations still traceable beneath the later Almohad and subsequent city, and scattered references within the better preserved administrative traditions of neighboring and successor states that occasionally mention Almoravid governance in passing. What doesn't survive, in anything resembling the volume a state of this scale and duration should reasonably have generated, is the direct administrative voice of the empire itself, explaining, in its own words, how a movement that began among Saharan religious reformers came to govern, tax, and administer territory stretching from West Africa to the heart of Iberia for the better part of a century. Marrakesh's foundations still lie beneath the modern city streets, layered beneath the Almohad and later Marinid and Sadian construction that followed the Almoravid collapse, much as Qalhat's earliest occupation layers sit beneath its own later, better documented Golden Age. Whether a meaningful portion of the Almoravid Empire's missing administrative archives still exists somewhere, misfiled within a later dynasty's records, buried beneath subsequent construction in Marrakesh or another former Almoravid administrative center, or lost permanently across 9 centuries of conquest, instability, and the ordinary decay medieval paper and parchment were never built to fully resist, remains a question historians of medieval North Africa continue to sit with, working from gold coins, foreign chronicles, and architectural fragments to reconstruct the outline of a government whose own voice has gone almost entirely silent. In the Burgundian countryside of eastern France, a single surviving tower and a few fragments of stone arcade are almost all that remain above ground of what was once, for nearly 7 centuries, the largest church in Christendom, and the administrative heart of the most powerful monastic network medieval Europe ever produced. This is Cluny Abbey, or rather, what the French Revolution left of it, and the story of its physical destruction, thoroughly documented and genuinely tragic in its scale, has tended to overshadow a quieter, less dramatic mystery sitting alongside it. The fate of the Abbey's own written archive, the administrative and correspondence record of an institution that once oversaw, at its height, well over 1,000 affiliated monasteries and priories stretching across France, Spain, England, Germany, and Italy. Cluny was founded in 910 AD, established with an unusually specific charter granting the new monastery direct exemption from local secular and episcopal authority, answerable instead only to the papacy itself, a structural innovation that allowed Cluny considerable independence to grow, reform, and expand its influence largely free from the kind of local political interference that constrained many contemporary monastic institutions. Over the following 2 centuries, under a remarkable succession of long-lived, capable abbots, Cluny didn't merely grow as a single monastery. It became the head of an entire monastic order, the Cluniac reform movement, with hundreds and eventually well over 1,000 dependent houses across Western Europe adopting Cluniac customs, liturgical practices, and, critically, formal administrative subordination to the abbot of Cluny himself, making the position one of the most powerful ecclesiastical offices in medieval Christendom, rivaling and at points arguably exceeding the practical influence of many bishops and even certain kings within the specific sphere of monastic and religious affairs. An institution operating at this scale, coordinating religious practice, property management, legal disputes, and personnel across more than 1,000 affiliated houses spanning several kingdoms, would necessarily have generated an administrative archive of genuinely enormous scope. Correspondence with dependent priories, records of donations and property acquisitions that made Cluny, by some medieval accounts, one of the wealthiest landholding institutions in Europe, papal bulls and confirmations of Cluny's privileged status, internal records of monastic discipline and reform, and the accumulated documentary residue of nearly 7 centuries of continuous institutional operation. Since Cluny, remarkably, survived as a functioning monastery from its 910 founding all the way through to its formal suppression during the French Revolution in 1790, a span of continuous operation exceeding 8.5 centuries, longer than the entire lifespan of several empires already discussed in this exploration. Given this extraordinary institutional longevity, a reasonable historian might expect Cluny's surviving archive to represent one of the richest, most continuous administrative records available from medieval Europe. In certain respects, this expectation is genuinely met. A substantial body of Cluniac charters, land grants, and property records does survive, primarily preserved not at Cluny itself, but through various dependent priories, later archival consolidations, and, in a considerable irony given the institution's eventual fate, through material that had already been transferred or copied to other locations before the Revolution's disruption. This surviving material has allowed historians to reconstruct a great deal about Cluny's economic holdings, its network of dependent houses, and its broader institutional relationships across the medieval period, making Cluny, in certain narrow documentary categories, actually reasonably well studied compared to some other institutions already examined in this series. Where the record becomes considerably more fragmentary, and where genuine historical uncertainty persists, involves the Abbey's central administrative and correspondence archive, the material that would have been physically housed at Cluny itself, documenting the abbot's direct governance of the order, internal Cluniac reform debates and disciplinary proceedings, and the day-to-day correspondence connecting the mother house to its enormous network of dependent priories. This category of material appears to have been disproportionately concentrated at the Abbey's own physical location, rather than distributed in duplicate across the wider Cluniac network the way property records tied to specific local priories more naturally would have been, and it is precisely this category of material that suffered the most severe, and, in the specific manner of its loss, the most genuinely troubling destruction during the Revolutionary period. The broad outline of Cluny's physical destruction is well documented, if painful to recount. Following the monastery's suppression in 1790 amid the broader dissolution of French religious orders during the Revolution, the abbey complex, including its enormous church, at the time still the largest in Christendom, larger even than the original St. Peter's Basilica had been before its Renaissance reconstruction, was sold off, and over the following decades, largely dismantled and demolished, its stone sold for building material, a process that continued into the early 19th century until only a small fraction of the original complex remained standing. What happened to the archive during this same period is considerably less consistently documented, and this is where the specific mystery this chapter addresses takes shape. Some portions of Cluny's central archive were reportedly dispersed to regional archival institutions and libraries during the revolutionary confiscation of monastic property, a pattern that, when it occurred systematically, has allowed some Cluniac material to survive today within French departmental archives and national collections. But contemporary and near-contemporary accounts also describe considerably less careful treatment of some archival material during the actual demolition and dispersal process, including specific, if not always fully detailed, references to documents being lost, damaged, or in some accounts deliberately destroyed or discarded as valueless amid the practical chaos of dismantling and selling off an enormous physical complex. At a moment when revolutionary authorities and property purchasers were considerably more focused on the material value of stone, lead roofing, and building materials than on the archival value of what may have been, in several documented cases, genuinely irreplaceable medieval manuscripts and correspondence. This creates a genuine and, by most historians' assessment, still not fully resolved, gap in understanding exactly how much of Cluny's central administrative archive was lost during this specific period, as opposed to how much may have survived, dispersed into private hands, sold to book dealers and collectors active during this period of religious institutional dissolution across France, or absorbed into other regional archives without necessarily being clearly catalogued as originally Cluniac material. A pattern of archival misattribution not unlike the one already discussed regarding potentially surviving Fatimid manuscripts scattered without clear provenance markers following Dar el-Ilm's own more gradual dispersal centuries earlier. Several specific categories of Cluniac material have generated particular scholarly interest precisely because chronicle references and later citations confirm they once existed in some form, while their current whereabouts, or continued survival, remain unconfirmed. Records of the specific internal reform debates and disciplinary proceedings that shaped Cluniac practice across the 11th and 12th centuries, a period of particularly significant internal development within the order, are known through later chronicle summaries and citations by medieval historians who apparently had direct access to now unlocated original material. But the original documents themselves, the actual internal correspondence and proceedings as opposed to later secondhand summaries, have not been definitively identified within any currently catalogued archive. Similarly, correspondence between Cluny's abbots and various medieval popes, some of whom maintained notably close relationships with the Cluniac order given the abbey's direct papal exemption and considerable political influence, is referenced in various secondary medieval sources in ways suggesting a considerably more extensive original correspondence than what currently survives in confirmed, directly attributable form. Some archival historians studying this gap have proposed that a meaningful portion of this missing material may still exist, uncatalogued or misattributed, within the extensive holdings of French regional archives and major libraries, particularly the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which absorbed considerable quantities of material from dissolved religious institutions during and after the revolutionary period, often without the kind of detailed, item-by-item provenance documentation that would allow modern researchers to easily identify specifically Cluniac material within a much larger, more generalized collection of monastic manuscripts acquired from numerous dissolved institutions simultaneously during the same general period. Under this reading, the mystery isn't necessarily one of physical destruction at all, but rather one of archival identification, genuine Cluniac material potentially sitting today within major, well-maintained collections, its specific origin simply not yet recognized or connected back to Cluny, by researchers working through an enormous volume of similarly dispersed material from dozens of other dissolved French monasteries, processed during the same chaotic administrative period. A smaller, more speculative line of inquiry has focused on the specific fate of material connected to Cluny's most sensitive internal affairs, proposing that certain categories of documentation, records touching on internal disciplinary matters, financial irregularities, or politically sensitive correspondence with medieval popes and kings, may have been deliberately destroyed or removed by Cluniac monks themselves in the final years before the revolutionary suppression, anticipating the dissolution and choosing to eliminate specific material considered too sensitive or potentially damaging to survive into secular custody, rather than allow it to fall into revolutionary authorities' hands. This remains difficult to confirm through direct evidence, and mainstream historians generally consider the more straightforward explanation: chaotic revolutionary-era dispersal and outright loss amid the practical business of demolishing and selling an enormous physical complex, sufficient to account for most of the documented gap without requiring a more deliberate, internally motivated act of preemptive archival destruction. What survives today allows historians a genuinely substantial, if incomplete, picture of Cluny's economic and institutional history across nearly 9 centuries of continuous operation, reconstructed primarily through property records, papal confirmations, and the writings of medieval chroniclers who had access to Cluniac material now itself lost or unlocated. The abbey's own direct institutional voice, the internal correspondence and administrative record of an order that once governed well over 1,000 religious houses across the breadth of medieval Europe, remains only partially recovered, scattered, by most historians' best assessment, somewhere between confirmed archival collections that haven't yet fully cataloged what they hold, private hands that received material during the revolutionary dispersal and whose subsequent history has gone unrecorded, and genuine permanent loss during a demolition process that valued Cluny's stone considerably more highly, in the moment, than its paper. The single surviving tower still stands above the Burgundian countryside, a fragment of what was once the largest church in Christendom, casting a shadow across a site whose stones were sold and scattered across 2.5 centuries ago, and whose written record, the actual voice of the abbots and monks who once governed one of medieval Europe's most powerful institutions, may be sitting closer than anyone currently realizes, in an archive that has simply never asked the right question of the manuscripts already sitting quietly on its shelves.